Self-help with illustrations of conduct and perseverance. Author, Samuel Smiles. Popular edition. London, John Murray, Albemarle Street. 1897. Preface. This is a revised edition of a book which has already been received with considerable favor at home and abroad. It has been reprinted in various forms in America, translations have appeared in Dutch and French, and others are about to appear in German and Danish. The book has, doubtless, proved attractive to readers in different countries by reason of the variety of anecdotal illustrations of life and character which it contains, and the interest which all more or less feel in the labors, the trials, the struggles, and the achievements of others. No one can be better aware than the author, of its fragmentary character, arising from the manner in which it was for the most part originally composed. Having been put together principally from jottings made during many years, intended as readings for young men, and without any view to publication. The appearance of this edition has furnished an opportunity for pruning the volume of some superfluous matter, and introducing various new illustrations, which will probably be found of general interest. In one respect the title of the book, which it is now too late to alter, has proved unfortunate, as it has led some, who have judged it merely by the title, to suppose that it consists of a eulogy of selfishness, the very opposite of what it really is, or at least of what the author intended it to be. Although its chief object unquestionably is to stimulate youths to apply themselves diligently to right pursuits, sparing neither labor, pains, nor self-denial in prosecuting them, and to rely upon their own efforts in life, rather than depend upon the help or patronage of others, it will also be found, from the examples given of literary and scientific men, artists, inventors, educators, philanthropists, missionaries, and martyrs, that the duty of helping one's self in the highest sense involves the helping of one's neighbors. It has also been objected to the book that too much notice is taken in it of men who have succeeded in life by helping themselves, and too little of the multitude of men who have failed. Why should not failure, it has been asked, have its Plutarch as well as success? There is, indeed, no reason why failure should not have its Plutarch, except that a record of mere failure would probably be found excessively depressing as well as uninstructive reading. It is, however, shown in the following pages that failure is the best discipline of the true worker, by stimulating him to renewed efforts, evoking his best powers, and carrying him onward in self-culture, self-control, and growth in knowledge and wisdom. Viewed in this light, failure, conquered by perseverance, is always full of interest and instruction, and this we have endeavored to illustrate by many examples. As for failure per se, although it may be well to find consolations for it at the close of life, there is reason to doubt whether it is an object that ought to be set before youth at the beginning of it. Indeed, how not to do it, is of all things the easiest learnt, it needs neither teaching, effort, self-denial, industry, patience, perseverance, nor judgment. Besides, readers do not care to know about the General P. Viwo lost his battles, the engineer whose engines blew up, the architect who designed only deformities, the painter who never got beyond daubs, the schemer who did not invent his machine, the merchant who could not keep out of the Gazette. It is true, the best of men may fail, in the best of causes. But even these best of men did not try to fail, or regard their failure as meritorious, on the contrary, they tried to succeed, and looked upon failure as misfortune. Failure in any good cause is, however, honorable, whilst success in any bad cause is merely infamous. At the same time success in the good cause is unquestionably better than failure. But it is not the result in any case that is to be regarded so much as the aim and the effort, the patience, the courage, and the endeavor with which desirable and worthy objects are pursued. 'Tis not in mortals to command success, we will do more, deserve it. The object of the book briefly is, to reinculcate these old-fashioned but wholesome lessons, which perhaps cannot be too often urged, that youth must work in order to enjoy, that nothing creditable can be accomplished without application and diligence, that the student must not be daunted by difficulties, but conquer them by patience and perseverance, and that, above all, he must seek elevation of character, without which capacity is worthless and worldly success is not. If the author has not succeeded in illustrating these lessons, he can only say that he has failed in his object. Among the new passages introduced in the present edition, may be mentioned the following: illustrious foreigners of humble origin, pages 10 to 12, French generals and marshals p. 8 risen from the ranks, 14, de Tocqueville and mutual help, 24, William Lee, M.A., and the stocking loom, 42, John Heathcote, M.P., and the bobbin net machine, 47, Jacquard and his loom, 55. Vaucanson, 58, Joshua Heilman and the combing machine, 62, Bernard Palissy and his struggles, 69, Botger, discoverer of hard porcelain, 80, Count de Buffon as student, 104, Cuvier, 128, Ambrose Père, 134, Claude Lorraine, 160, Jacques Callot, 162, Benvenuto Cellini, 164, Nicolas Poussin, 168, Ary Scheffer, 171, The Struts of Belper, 214, Francis Xavier, 238, Napoleon as a Man of Business, 276, Intrepidity of Deal Boatman, 400. Besides numerous other passages which it is unnecessary to specify. London, May, 1866. Introduction to the first edition. The origin of this book may be briefly told. Some 15 years since, the author was requested to deliver an address before the members of some evening classes, which had been formed in a northern town for mutual improvement, under the following circumstances. 2 or 3 young men of the humblest rank resolved to meet in the winter evenings, for the purpose of improving themselves by exchanging knowledge with each other. Their first meetings were held in the room of a cottage in which one of the members lived, and, as others shortly joined them, the place soon became inconveniently filled. When summer set in, they adjourned to the cottage garden outside. And the classes were then held in the open air, round a little boarded hut used as a garden house, in which those who officiated as teachers set the sums, and gave forth the lessons of the evening. When the weather was fine, the youths might be seen, until a late hour, hanging round the door of the hut like a cluster of bees, but sometimes a sudden shower of rain would dash the sums from their slates, and disperse them for the evening unsatisfied. Winter, with its cold nights, was drawing near, and what were they to do for shelter? Their numbers had by P.'s time so increased, that no room of an ordinary cottage could accommodate them. Though they were for the most part young men earning comparatively small weekly wages, they resolved to incur the risk of hiring a room, and, on making inquiry, they found a large dingy apartment to let, which had been used as a temporary cholera hospital. No tenant could be found for the place, which was avoided as if the plague still clung to it. But the mutual improvement youths, nothing daunted, hired the cholera room at so much a week, lit it up, placed a few benches and a deal table in it, and began their winter classes. The place soon presented a busy and cheerful appearance in the evenings. The teaching may have been, as no doubt it was, of a very rude and imperfect sort, but it was done with a will. Those who knew a little taught those who knew less, improving themselves while they improved the others, and, at all events, setting before them a good working example. Thus these youths, and there were also grown men amongst them, proceeded to teach themselves and each other, reading and writing, arithmetic and geography, and even mathematics, chemistry, and some of the modern languages. About 100 young men had thus come together, when, growing ambitious, they desired to have lectures delivered to them, and then it was that the author became acquainted with their proceedings. A party of them waited on him, for the purpose of inviting him to deliver an introductory address, or, as they expressed it, to talk to them a bit, prefacing the request by a modest statement of what they had done and what they were doing. He could not fail to be touched by the admirable self-helping spirit P.'s which they had displayed, and, though entertaining but slight faith in popular lecturing, he felt that a few words of encouragement, honestly and sincerely uttered, might not be without some good effect. And in this spirit he addressed them on more than one occasion, citing examples of what other men had done, as illustrations of what each might, in a greater or less degree, do for himself. And pointing out that their happiness and well-being as individuals in after life, must necessarily depend mainly upon themselves, upon their own diligent self-culture, self-discipline, and self-control, and, above all, on that honest and upright performance of individual duty, which is the glory of manly character. There was nothing in the slightest degree new or original in this counsel, which was as old as the Proverbs of Solomon, and possibly quite as familiar. But old-fashioned though the advice may have been, it was welcomed. The youths went forward in their course, worked on with energy and resolution, and, reaching manhood, they went forth in various directions into the world, where many of them now occupy positions of trust and usefulness. Several years after the incidents referred to, the subject was unexpectedly recalled to the author's recollection by an evening visit from a young man, apparently fresh from the work of a foundry, who explained that he was now an employer of labor and a thriving man, and he was pleased to remember with gratitude the words spoken in all honesty to him and to his fellow pupils years before, and even to attribute some measure of his success in life to the endeavors which he had made to work up to their spirit. p. 12. The author's personal interest having in this way been attracted to the subject of self-help, he was accustomed to add to the memoranda from which he had addressed these young men, and to note down occasionally in his leisure evening moments, after the hours of business, the results of such reading, observation, and experience of life, as he conceived to bear upon it. One of the most prominent illustrations cited in his earlier addresses, was that of George Stephenson, the engineer. And the original interest of the subject, as well as the special facilities and opportunities which the author possessed for illustrating Mr. Stephenson's life and career, induced him to prosecute it at his leisure, and eventually to publish his biography. The present volume is written in a similar spirit, as it has been similar in its origin. The illustrative sketches of character introduced, are, however, necessarily less elaborately treated. Being busts rather than full-length portraits, and, in many of the cases, only some striking feature has been noted, the lives of individuals, as indeed of nations, often concentrating their luster and interest in a few passages. Such as the book is, the author now leaves it in the hands of the reader, in the hope that the lessons of industry, perseverance, and self-culture, which it contains, will be found useful and instructive, as well as generally interesting. London, September, 1859. Chapter I. Self-help, national and individual. The worth of a state, in the long run, is the worth of the individuals composing it. J. S. Mill. We put too much faith in systems, and look too little to men. B. Disraeli. Heaven helps those who help themselves, is a well-tried maxim, embodying in a small compass the results of vast human experience. The spirit of self-help is the root of all genuine growth in the individual. And, exhibited in the lives of many, it constitutes the true source of national vigor and strength. Help from without is often enfeebling in its effects, but help from within invariably invigorates. Whatever is done for men or classes, to a certain extent takes away the stimulus and necessity of doing for themselves, and where men are subjected to over-guidance and over-government, the inevitable tendency is to render them comparatively helpless. Even the best institutions can give a man no active help. Perhaps the most they can do is, to leave him free to develop himself and improve his individual condition. But in all times men have been prone to believe that their happiness and well-being were to be secured by means of institutions rather than by their own conduct. Hence the value of legislation as an agent in human advancement has usually been much overestimated. To constitute the millionth part of a legislature, by voting for 1 or 2 men once in 3 or 5 years, however conscientiously this duty may be performed, can exercise but little active influence upon any man's life and character. Moreover, it is every day becoming more clearly understood, that the function of government is negative and restrictive, rather than positive and active, being resolvable principally into protection of life, liberty, and property. Laws, wisely administered, will secure men in the enjoyment of the fruits of their labor, whether of mind or body, at a comparatively small personal sacrifice, but no laws, however stringent, can make the idle industrious, the thriftless provident, or the drunken sober. Such reforms can only be effected by means of individual action, economy, and self-denial, by better habits, rather than by greater rights. The government of a nation itself is usually found to be but the reflex of the individuals composing it. The government that is ahead of the people will inevitably be dragged down to their level, as the government that is behind them will in the long run be dragged up. In the order of nature, the collective character of a nation will as surely find its befitting results in its law and government, as water finds its own level. The noble people will be nobly ruled, and the ignorant and corrupt ignobly. Indeed, all experience serves to prove that the worth and strength of a state depend far less upon the form of its institutions than upon the character of its men. For the nation is only an aggregate of individual conditions, and civilization itself is but a question of the personal improvement of the men, women, and children of whom society is composed. National progress is the sum of individual industry, energy, and uprightness, as national decay is of individual idleness, selfishness, and vice. What we are accustomed to decry as great social evils, will, for the most part, be found to be but the outgrowth of man's own perverted life. And though we may endeavor to cut them down and extirpate them by means of law, they will only spring up again with fresh luxuriance in some other form, unless the conditions of personal life and character are radically improved. If this view be correct, then it follows that the highest patriotism and philanthropy consist, not so much in altering laws and modifying institutions, as in helping and stimulating men to elevate and improve themselves by their own free and independent individual action. It may be of comparatively little consequence how a man is governed from without, whilst everything depends upon how he governs himself from within. The greatest slave is not he who is ruled by a despot, great though that evil be, but he who is the thrall of his own moral ignorance, selfishness, and vice. Nations who are thus enslaved at heart cannot be freed by any mere changes of masters or of institutions. And so long as the fatal delusion prevails, that liberty solely depends upon and consists in government, so long will such changes, no matter at what cost they may be effected, have as little practical and lasting result as the shifting of the figures in a phantasmagoria. The solid foundations of liberty must rest upon individual character, which is also the only sure guarantee for social security and national progress. John Stuart Mill truly observes that, even despotism does not produce its worst effects so long as individuality exists under it, and whatever crushes individuality is despotism, by whatever name it be called. Old fallacies as to human progress are constantly turning up. Some call for Caesars, others for nationalities, and others for acts of parliament. We are to wait for Caesars, and when they are found, happy the people who recognize and follow them. 4. This doctrine shortly means, everything for the people, nothing by them, a doctrine which, if taken as a guide, must, by destroying the free conscience of a community, speedily prepare the way for any form of despotism. Caesarism is human idolatry in its worst form, a worship of mere power, as degrading in its effects as the worship of mere wealth would be. A far healthier doctrine to inculcate among the nations would be that of self-help. And so soon as it is thoroughly understood and carried into action, Caesarism will be no more. The two principles are directly antagonistic, and what Victor Hugo said of the pen and the sword alike applies to them, Caesitura Sela. This will kill that. The power of nationalities and acts of parliament is also a prevalent superstition. What William Dargan, one of Ireland's truest patriots, said at the closing of the first Dublin Industrial Exhibition, may well be quoted now. To tell the truth, he said, I never heard the word independence mentioned that my own country and my own fellow townsmen did not occur to my mind. I have heard a great deal about the independence that we were to get from this, that, and the other place, and of the great expectations we were to have from persons from other countries coming amongst us. Whilst I value as much as any man the great advantages that must result to us from that intercourse, I have always been deeply impressed with the feeling that our industrial independence is dependent upon ourselves. I believe that with simple industry and careful exactness in the utilization of our energies, we never had a fairer chance nor a brighter prospect than the present. We have made a step, but perseverance is the great agent of success. And if we but go on zealously, I believe in my conscience that in a short period we shall arrive at a position of equal comfort, of equal happiness, and of equal independence, with that of any other people. All nations have been made what they are by the thinking and the working of many generations of men. Patient and persevering laborers in all ranks and conditions of life, cultivators of the soil and explorers of the mine, inventors and discoverers, manufacturers, mechanics and artisans, poets, philosophers, and politicians, all have contributed towards the grand result, one generation building upon another's labors, and carrying them forward to still higher stages. This constant succession of noble workers, the artisans of civilization, has served to create order out of chaos in industry, science, and art, and the living race has thus, in the course of nature, become the inheritor of the rich estate provided by the skill and industry of our forefathers, which is placed in our hands to cultivate and to hand down, not only unimpaired but improved, to our successors. The spirit of self-help, as exhibited in the energetic action of individuals, has in all times been a marked feature. Continually, that proficiency is attained and reputation acquired. But Luca, notwithstanding all his application and industry, did not succeed in earning enough money by sculpture to enable him to live by the art, and the idea occurred to him that he might nevertheless be able to pursue his modeling in some material more facile and less dear than marble. Hence it was that he began to make his models in clay, and to endeavor by experiment so to coat and bake the clay as to render those models durable. After many trials he at length discovered a method of covering the clay with a material, which, when exposed to the intense heat of a furnace, became converted into an almost imperishable enamel. He afterwards made the further discovery of a method of imparting color to the enamel, thus greatly adding to its beauty. The fame of Luca's work extended throughout Europe, and specimens of his art became widely diffused. Many of them were sent into France and Spain, where they were greatly prized. At that time coarse brown jars and pipkins were almost the only articles of earthenware produced in France, and this continued to be the case, with comparatively small improvement, until the time of Palissy. A man who toiled and fought against stupendous difficulties with a heroism that sheds a glow almost of romance over the events of his checkered life. Bernard Palissy is supposed to have been born in the south of France, in the diocese of Agen, about the year 1510. His father was probably a worker in glass, to which trade Bernard was brought up. His parents were poor people, too poor to give him the benefit of any school education. "I had no other books," said he afterwards, "than heaven and earth, which are open to all." He learnt, however, the art of glass painting, to which he added that of drawing, and afterwards reading and writing. When about 18 years old, the glass trade becoming decayed, Palissy left his father's house, with his wallet on his back, and went out into the world to search whether there was any place in it for him. He first travelled towards Gascony, working at his trade where he could find employment, and occasionally occupying part of his time in land measuring. Then he travelled northwards, sojourning for various periods at different places in France, Flanders, and Lower Germany. Thus Palissy occupied about 10 more years of his life, after which he married, and ceased from his wanderings, settling down to practice glass painting and land measuring at the small town of Saints, in the Lower Charente. Their children were born to him, and not only his responsibilities but his expenses increased, while, do what he could, his earnings remained too small for his needs. It was therefore necessary for him to bestir himself. Probably he felt capable of better things than drudging in an employment so precarious as glass painting, and hence he was induced to turn his attention to the kindred art of painting and enameling earthenware. Yet on this subject he was wholly ignorant. For he had never seen earth baked before he began his operations. He had therefore everything to learn by himself, without any helper. But he was full of hope, eager to learn, of unbounded perseverance and inexhaustible patience. It was the sight of an elegant cup of Italian manufacture, most probably one of Luca della Robbia's make, which first set Palissy a-thinking about the new art. A circumstance so apparently insignificant would have produced no effect upon an ordinary mind, or even upon Palissy himself at an ordinary time, but occurring as it did when he was meditating a change of calling, he at once became inflamed with the desire of imitating it. The sight of this cup disturbed his whole existence, and the determination to discover the enamel with which it was glazed thenceforward possessed him like a passion. Had he been a single man he might have travelled into Italy in search of the secret, but he was bound to his wife and his children, and could not leave them, so he remained by their side groping in the dark in the hope of finding out the process of making and enameling earthenware. At first he could merely guess the materials of which the enamel was composed, and he proceeded to try all manner of experiments to ascertain what they really were. He pounded all the substances which he supposed were likely to produce it. Then he bought common earthen pots, broke them into pieces, and, spreading his compounds over them, subjected them to the heat of a furnace which he erected for the purpose of baking them. His experiments failed, and the results were broken pots and a waste of fuel, drugs, time, and labor. Women do not readily sympathize with experiments whose only tangible effect is to dissipate the means of buying clothes and food for their children, and Palissy's wife, however dutiful in other respects, could not be reconciled to the purchase of more earthen pots, which seemed to her to be bought only to be broken. Yet she must needs submit, for Palissy had become thoroughly possessed by the determination to master the secret of the enamel, and would not leave it alone. For many successive months and years Palissy pursued his experiments. The first furnace having proved a failure, he proceeded to erect another out of doors. There he burnt more wood, spoiled more drugs and pots, and lost more time, until poverty stared him and his family in the face. Thus, said he, I fooled away several years, with sorrow and sighs, because I could not at all arrive at my intention. In the intervals of his experiments he occasionally worked at his former callings, painting on glass, drawing portraits, and measuring land, but his earnings from these sources were very small. At length he was no longer able to carry on his experiments in his own furnace because of the heavy cost of fuel. But he bought more potsherds, broke them up as before into 300 or 400 pieces, and, covering them with chemicals, carried them to a tilework a league and a half distant from Saints, there to be baked in an ordinary furnace. After the operation he went to see the pieces taken out, and, to his dismay, the whole of the experiments were failures. But though disappointed, he was not yet defeated, for he determined on the very spot to begin afresh. His business as a land measurer called him away for a brief season from the pursuit of his experiments. In conformity with an edict of the state, it became necessary to survey the salt marshes in the neighborhood of Saints for the purpose of levying the land tax. Palissy was employed to make this survey, and prepare the requisite map. The work occupied him some time, and he was doubtless well paid for it. But no sooner was it completed than he proceeded, with redoubled zeal, to follow up his old investigations, in the track of the enamels. He began by breaking 36 new earthen pots, the pieces of which he covered with different materials which he had compounded, and then took them to a neighboring glass furnace to be baked. The results gave him a glimmer of hope. The greater heat of the glass furnace had melted some of the compounds. But though Palissy searched diligently for the white enamel he could find none. For 2 more years he went on experimenting without any satisfactory result, until the proceeds of his survey of the salt marshes having become nearly spent, he was reduced to poverty again. But he resolved to make a last great effort, and he began by breaking more pots than ever. More than 300 pieces of pottery covered with his compounds were sent to the glass furnace. And thither he himself went to watch the results of the baking. 4 hours passed, during which he watched, and then the furnace was opened. The material on one only of the 300 pieces of potsherd had melted, and it was taken out to cool. As it hardened, it grew white and polished. The piece of potsherd was covered with white enamel, described by Palissy as singularly beautiful. And beautiful it must no doubt have been in his eyes after all his weary waiting. He ran home with it to his wife, feeling himself, as he expressed it, quite a new creature. But the prize was not yet won, far from it. The partial success of this intended last effort merely had the effect of luring him on to a succession of further experiments and failures. In order that he might complete the invention, which he now believed to be at hand, he resolved to build for himself a glass furnace near his dwelling, where he might carry on his operations in secret. He proceeded to build the furnace with his own hands, carrying the bricks from the brickfield upon his back. He was bricklayer, laborer, and all. From 7 to 8 more months passed. At last the furnace was built and ready for use. Palissy had in the meantime fashioned a number of vessels of clay in readiness for the laying on of the enamel. After being subjected to a preliminary process of baking, they were covered with the enamel compound, and again placed in the furnace for the grand crucial experiment. Although his means were nearly exhausted, Palissy had been for some time accumulating a great store of fuel for the final effort, and he thought it was enough. At last the fire was lit, and the operation proceeded. All day he sat by the furnace, feeding it with fuel. He sat there watching and feeding all through the long night. But the enamel did not melt. The sun rose upon his labors. His wife brought him a portion of the scanty morning meal, for he would not stir from the furnace, into which he continued from time to time to heave more fuel. The second day passed, and still the enamel did not melt. The sun set, and another night passed. The pale, haggard, unshorn, baffled yet not beaten Palissy sat by his furnace eagerly looking for the melting of the enamel. A third day and night passed. A fourth, a fifth, and even a sixth, yes, for 6 long days and nights did the unconquerable Palissy watch and toil, fighting against hope, and still the enamel would not melt. It then occurred to him that there might be some defect in the materials for the enamel, perhaps something wanting in the flux, so he set to work to pound and compound fresh materials for a new experiment. Thus 2 or 3 more weeks passed. But how to buy more pots? For those which he had made with his own hands for the purposes of the first experiment were by long baking irretrievably spoilt for the purposes of a second. His money was now all spent, but he could borrow. His character was still good, though his wife and the neighbors thought him foolishly wasting his means in futile experiments. Nevertheless he succeeded. He borrowed sufficient from a friend to enable him to buy more fuel and more pots, and he was again ready for a further experiment. The pots were covered with the new compound, placed in the furnace, and the fire was again lit. It was the last and most desperate experiment of the whole. The fire blazed up, the heat became intense, but still the enamel did not melt. The fuel began to run short. How to keep up the fire? There were the garden palings, these would burn. They must be sacrificed rather than that the great experiment should fail. The garden palings were pulled up and cast into the furnace. They were burnt in vain. The enamel had not yet melted. 10 minutes more heat might do it. Fuel must be had at whatever cost. There remained the household furniture and shelving. A crashing noise was heard in the house, and amidst the screams of his wife and children, who now feared Palissy's reason was giving way, the tables were seized, broken up, and heaved into the furnace. The enamel had not melted yet. There remained the shelving. Another noise of the wrenching of timber was heard within the house. And the shelves were torn down and hurled after the furniture into the fire. Wife and children then rushed from the house, and went frantically through the town, calling out that poor Palissy had gone mad, and was breaking up his very furniture for firewood. 74. For an entire month his shirt had not been off his back, and he was utterly worn out, wasted with toil, anxiety, watching, and want of food. He was in debt, and seemed on the verge of ruin. But he had at length mastered the secret. For the last great burst of heat had melted the enamel. The common brown household jars, when taken out of the furnace after it had become cool, were found covered with a white glaze. For this he could endure reproach, contumely, and scorn, and wait patiently for the opportunity of putting his discovery into practice as better days came round. Palissy next hired a potter to make some earthen vessels after designs which he furnished, while he himself proceeded to model some medallions in clay for the purpose of enameling them. But how to maintain himself and his family until the wares were made and ready for sale? Fortunately there remained one man in Saints who still believed in the integrity, if not in the judgment, of Palissy, an innkeeper, who agreed to feed and lodge him for 6 months, while he went on with his manufacture. As for the working potter whom he had hired, Palissy soon found that he could not pay him the stipulated wages. Having already stripped his dwelling, he could but strip himself, and he accordingly parted with some of his clothes to the potter, in part payment of the wages which he owed him. Palissy next erected an improved furnace, but he was so unfortunate as to build part of the inside with flints. When it was heated, these flints cracked and burst, and the spiculae were scattered over the pieces of pottery, sticking to them. Though the enamel came out right, the work was irretrievably spoilt, and thus 6 more months' labor was lost. Persons were found willing to buy the articles at a low price, notwithstanding the injury they had sustained, but Palissy would not sell them, considering that to have done so would be to decry and abate his honor. And so he broke in pieces the entire batch. Nevertheless, says he, hope continued to inspire me, and I held on manfully. Sometimes, when visitors called, I entertained them with pleasantry, while I was really sad at heart. Worst of all the sufferings I had to endure, were the mockeries and persecutions of those of my own household, who were so unreasonable as to expect me to execute work without the means of doing so. For years my furnaces were without any covering or protection, and while attending them I have been for nights at the mercy of the wind and the rain, without help or consolation, save it might be the wailing of cats on the one side and the howling of dogs on the other. Sometimes the tempest would beat so furiously against the furnaces that I was compelled to leave them and seek shelter within doors. Drenched by rain, and in no better plight than if I had been dragged through mire, I have gone to lie down at midnight or at daybreak, stumbling into the house without a light, and reeling from one side to another as if I had been drunken, but really weary with watching and filled with sorrow at the loss of my labor after such long toiling. But alas! My home proved no refuge. For, drenched and besmeared as I was, I found in my chamber a second persecution worse than the first, which makes me even now marvel that I was not utterly consumed by my many sorrows. At this stage of his affairs, Palissy became melancholy and almost hopeless, and seems to have all but broken down. He wandered gloomily about the fields near Saints, his clothes hanging in tatters, and himself worn to a skeleton. In a curious passage in his writings he describes how that the calves of his legs had disappeared and were no longer able with the help of garters to hold up his stockings, which fell about his heels when he walked. 77. The family continued to reproach him for his recklessness, and his neighbors cried shame upon him for his obstinate folly. So he returned for a time to his former calling. And after about a year's diligent labor, during which he earned bread for his household and somewhat recovered his character among his neighbors, he again resumed his darling enterprise. But though he had already spent about 10 years in the search for the enamel, it cost him nearly 8 more years of experimental plodding before he perfected his invention. He gradually learnt dexterity and certainty of result by experience, gathering practical knowledge out of many failures. Every mishap was a fresh lesson to him, teaching him something new about the nature of enamels, the qualities of argillaceous earths, the tempering of clays, and the construction and management of furnaces. At last, after about 16 years' labor, Palissy took heart and called himself potter. These 16 years had been his term of apprenticeship to the art, during which he had wholly to teach himself, beginning at the very beginning. He was now able to sell his wares and thereby maintain his family in comfort. But he never rested satisfied with what he had accomplished. He proceeded from one step of improvement to another, always aiming at the greatest perfection possible. He studied natural objects for patterns, and with such success that the great Buffon spoke of him as so great a naturalist as nature only can produce. His ornamental pieces are now regarded as rare gems in the cabinets of virtuosi, and sell at almost fabulous prices. 78. The ornaments on them are for the most part accurate models from life, of wild animals, lizards, and plants, found in the fields about Saints, and tastefully combined as ornaments into the texture of a plate or vase. When Palissy had reached the height of his art he styled himself Ouvrier de terre et inventeur de rustiques figulins. We have not, however, come to an end of the sufferings of Palissy, respecting which a few words remain to be said. Being a Protestant, at a time when religious persecution waxed hot in the south of France, and expressing his views without fear, he was regarded as a dangerous heretic. His enemies having informed against him, his house at Saints was entered by the officers of justice, and his workshop was thrown open to the rabble, who entered and smashed his pottery, while he himself was hurried off by night and cast into a dungeon at Bordeaux, to wait his turn at the stake or the scaffold. He was condemned to be burnt, but a powerful noble, the Constable de Montmorency, interposed to save his life. Not because he had any special regard for Palissy or his religion, but because no other artist could be found capable of executing the enameled pavement for his magnificent chateau then in course of erection at Écouen, about 4 leagues from Paris. By his influence an edict was issued appointing Palissy inventor of rustic figurines to the king and to the constable, which had the effect of immediately removing him from the jurisdiction of Bordeaux. He was accordingly liberated, and returned to his home at Saints only to find it devastated and broken up. His workshop was open to the sky, and his works lay in ruins. Shaking the dust of Saints from his feet, he left the place never to return to it, and removed to Paris to carry on the works ordered of him by the constable and the Queen Mother, being lodged in the Tuileries, 79, while so occupied. Besides carrying on the manufacture of pottery, with the aid of his 2 sons, Palissy, during the latter part of his life, wrote and published several books on the potter's art, with a view to the instruction of his countrymen, and in order that they might avoid the many mistakes which he himself had made. He also wrote on agriculture, on fortification, and natural history, on which latter subject he even delivered lectures to a limited number of persons. He waged war against astrology, alchemy, witchcraft, and like impost. Plan of a machine for the purpose. His friend, the manufacturer, again furnished him with the means of carrying out his idea, and in 3 weeks Jacquard had completed his invention. Jacquard's achievement having come to the knowledge of the prefect of the department, he was summoned before that functionary, and, on his explanation of the working of the machine, a report on the subject was forwarded to the emperor. The inventor was forthwith summoned to Paris with his machine, and brought into the presence of the emperor, who received him with the consideration due to his genius. The interview lasted 2 hours, during which Jacquard, placed at his ease by the emperor's affability, explained to him the improvements which he proposed to make in the looms for weaving figured goods. The result was, that he was provided with apartments in the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers, where he had the use of the workshop during his stay, and was provided with a suitable allowance for his maintenance. Installed in the Conservatoire, Jacquard proceeded to complete the details of his improved loom. He had the advantage of minutely inspecting the various exquisite pieces of mechanism contained in that great treasury of human ingenuity. Among the machines which more particularly attracted his attention, and eventually set him upon the track of his discovery, was a loom for weaving flowered silk, made by Vaucanson, the celebrated automaton maker. Vaucanson was a man of the highest order of constructive genius. The inventive faculty was so strong in him that it may almost be said to have amounted to a passion, and could not be restrained. The saying that the poet is born, not made, applies with equal force to the inventor, who, though indebted, like the other, to culture and improved opportunities, nevertheless contrives and constructs new combinations of machinery mainly to gratify his own instinct. This was peculiarly the case with Vaucanson, for his most elaborate works were not so much distinguished for their utility as for the curious ingenuity which they displayed. While a mere boy attending Sunday conversations with his mother, he amused himself by watching, through the chinks of a partition wall, part of the movements of a clock in the adjoining apartment. He endeavored to understand them, and by brooding over the subject, after several months he discovered the principle of the escapement. From that time the subject of mechanical invention took complete possession of him. With some rude tools which he contrived, he made a wooden clock that marked the hours with remarkable exactness, while he made for a miniature chapel the figures of some angels which waved their wings, and some priests that made several ecclesiastical movements. With the view of executing some other automata he had designed, he proceeded to study anatomy, music, and mechanics, which occupied him for several years. The sight of the flute player in the gardens of the Tuileries inspired him with the resolution to invent a similar figure that should play, and after several years' study and labor, though struggling with illness, he succeeded in accomplishing his object. He next produced a flageolet player, which was succeeded by a duck, the most ingenious of his contrivances, which swam, dabbled, drank, and quacked like a real duck. He next invented an ASP, employed in the tragedy of Cleopatra, which hissed and darted at the bosom of the actress. Vaucanson, however, did not confine himself merely to the making of automata. By reason of his ingenuity, Cardinal de Fleury appointed him inspector of the silk manufactories of France, and he was no sooner in office, than with his usual irrepressible instinct to invent, he proceeded to introduce improvements in silk machinery. One of these was his mill for thrown silk, which so excited the anger of the Lyons operatives, who feared the loss of employment through its means, that they pelted him with stones and had nearly killed him. He nevertheless went on inventing, and next produced a machine for weaving flowered silks, with a contrivance for giving a dressing to the thread, so as to render that of each bobbin or skein of an equal thickness. When Vaucanson died in 1782, after a long illness, he bequeathed his collection of machines to the Queen, who seems to have set but small value on them, and they were shortly after dispersed. But his machine for weaving flowered silks was happily preserved in the Conservatoire d'Arts et Métiers, and their jacquard found it among the many curious and interesting articles in the collection. It proved of the utmost value to him, for it immediately set him on the track of the principal modification which he introduced in his improved loom. One of the chief features of Vaucanson's machine was a pierced cylinder which, according to the holes it presented when revolved, regulated the movement of certain needles, and caused the threads of the warp to deviate in such a manner as to produce a given design, though only of a simple character. Jacquard seized upon the suggestion with avidity, and, with the genius of the true inventor, at once proceeded to improve upon it. At the end of a month his weaving machine was completed. To the cylinder of Vaucanson, he added an endless piece of pasteboard pierced with a number of holes, through which the threads of the warp were presented to the weaver, while another piece of mechanism indicated to the workman the color of the shuttle which he ought to throw. Thus the drawboy and the reader of designs were both at once superseded. The first use Jacquard made of his new loom was to weave with it several yards of rich stuff which he presented to the Empress Josephine. Napoleon was highly gratified with the result of the inventor's labors, and ordered a number of the looms to be constructed by the best workmen, after Jacquard's model, and presented to him, after which he returned to Lyons. There he experienced the frequent fate of inventors. He was regarded by his townsmen as an enemy, and treated by them as Hargreaves and Arkwright had been in Lancashire. The workmen looked upon the new loom as fatal to their trade, and feared lest it should at once take the bread from their mouths. A tumultuous meeting was held on the Place de Terreaux, when it was determined to destroy the machines. This was however prevented by the military. But Jacquard was denounced and hanged in effigy. The Conseil de Prud'hommes in vain endeavored to allay the excitement, and they were themselves denounced. At length, carried away by the popular impulse, the Prud'hommes, most of whom had been workmen and sympathized with the class, had one of Jacquard's looms carried off and publicly broken in pieces. Riots followed, in one of which Jacquard was dragged along the quay by an infuriated mob intending to drown him, but he was rescued. The great value of the Jacquard loom, however, could not be denied, and its success was only a question of time. Jacquard was urged by some English silk manufacturers to pass over into England and settle there. But notwithstanding the harsh and cruel treatment he had received at the hands of his townspeople, his patriotism was too strong to permit him to accept their offer. The English manufacturers, however, adopted his loom. Then it was, and only then, that Lyons, threatened to be beaten out of the field, adopted it with eagerness, and before long the Jacquard machine was employed in nearly all kinds of weaving. The result proved that the fears of the workpeople had been entirely unfounded. Instead of diminishing employment, the Jacquard loom increased it at least tenfold. The number of persons occupied in the manufacture of figured goods in Lyons was stated by M. Léon Fauché to have been 60,000 in 1833. And that number has since been considerably increased. As for Jacquard himself, the rest of his life passed peacefully, excepting that the workpeople who dragged him along the quay to drown him were shortly after found eager to bear him in triumph along the same route in celebration of his birthday. But his modesty would not permit him to take part in such a demonstration. The Municipal Council of Lyons proposed to him that he should devote himself to improving his machine for the benefit of the local industry, to which Jacquard agreed in consideration of a moderate pension, the amount of which was fixed by himself. After perfecting his invention accordingly, he retired at 60 to end his days at Ullans, his father's native place. It was there that he received, in 1820, the decoration of the Legion of Honor. And it was there that he died and was buried in 1834. A statue was erected to his memory, but his relatives remained in poverty, and 20 years after his death, his two nieces were under the necessity of selling for a few hundred francs the gold medal bestowed upon their uncle by Louis XVIII. Such, says a French writer, was the gratitude of the manufacturing interests of Lyons to the man to whom it owes so large a portion of its splendor. It would be easy to extend the martyrology of inventors, and to cite the names of other equally distinguished men who have, without any corresponding advantage to themselves, contributed to the industrial progress of the age, for it has too often happened that genius has planted the tree, of which patient dullness has gathered the fruit. But we will confine ourselves for the present to a brief account of an inventor of comparatively recent date, by way of illustration of the difficulties and privations which it is so frequently the lot of mechanical genius to surmount. We allude to Joshua Heilmann, the inventor of the combing machine. Heilmann was born in 1796 at Mulhouse, the principal seat of the Alsace cotton manufacture. His father was engaged in that business, and Joshua entered his office at 15. He remained there for 2 years, employing his spare time in mechanical drawing. He afterwards spent 2 years in his uncle's banking house in Paris, prosecuting the study of mathematics in the evenings. Some of his relatives having established a small cotton spinning factory at Mulhouse, young Heilmann was placed with Messrs. Tizot and Ray, at Paris, to learn the practice of that firm. At the same time he became a student at the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers, where he attended the lectures, and studied the machines in the museum. He also took practical lessons in turning from a toymaker. After some time, thus diligently occupied, he returned to Alsace, to superintend the construction of the machinery for the new factory at Vieuxthon, which was shortly finished and set to work. The operations of the manufactory were, however, seriously affected by a commercial crisis which occurred, and it passed into other hands, on which Heilmann returned to his family at Mulhouse. He had in the meantime been occupying much of his leisure with inventions, more particularly in connection with the weaving of cotton and the preparation of the staple for spinning. One of his earliest contrivances was an embroidering machine, in which 20 needles were employed, working simultaneously, and he succeeded in accomplishing his object after about 6 months' labor. For this invention, which he exhibited at the Exposition of 1834, he received a gold medal, and was decorated with the Legion of Honor. Other inventions quickly followed. An improved loom, a machine for measuring and folding fabrics, an improvement of the bobbin and fly frames of the English spinners, and a weft winding machine, with various improvements in the machinery for preparing, spinning, and weaving silk and cotton. One of his most ingenious contrivances was his loom for weaving simultaneously 2 pieces of velvet or other piled fabric, united by the pile common to both, with a knife and traversing apparatus for separating the 2 fabrics when woven. But by far the most beautiful and ingenious of his inventions was the combing machine, the history of which we now proceed shortly to describe. Heilmann had for some years been diligently studying the contrivance of a machine for combing long stapled cotton, the ordinary carding machine being found ineffective in preparing the raw material for spinning, especially the finer sorts of yarn, besides causing considerable waste. To avoid these imperfections, the cotton spinners of Alsace offered a prize of 5,000 francs for an improved combing machine, and Heilmann immediately proceeded to compete for the reward. He was not stimulated by the desire of gain, for he was comparatively rich, having acquired a considerable fortune by his wife. It was a saying of his that, one will never accomplish great things who is constantly asking himself, how much gain will this bring me? What mainly impelled him was the irrepressible instinct of the inventor, who no sooner has a mechanical problem set before him than he feels impelled to undertake its solution. The problem in this case was, however, much more difficult than he had anticipated. The close study of the subject occupied him for several years, and the expenses in which he became involved in connection with it were so great, that his wife's fortune was shortly swallowed up, and he was reduced to poverty, without being able to bring his machine to perfection. From that time he was under the necessity of relying mainly on the help of his friends to enable him to prosecute the invention. While still struggling with poverty and difficulties, Heilmann's wife died, believing her husband ruined, and shortly after he proceeded to England and settled for a time at Manchester, still laboring at his machine. He had a model made for him by the eminent machine makers, Sharp, Roberts, and Company, but still he could not make it work satisfactorily, and he was at length brought almost to the verge of despair. He returned to France to visit his family, still pursuing his idea, which had obtained complete possession of his mind. While sitting by his hearth one evening, meditating upon the hard fate of inventors and the misfortunes in which their families so often become involved, he found himself almost unconsciously watching his daughters combing their long hair and drawing it out at full length between their fingers. The thought suddenly struck him that if he could successfully imitate in a machine the process of combing out the longest hair and forcing back the short by reversing the action of the comb, it might serve to extricate him from his difficulty. It may be remembered that this incident in the life of Heilmann has been made the subject of a beautiful picture by Mr. Elmore, R.A., which was exhibited at the Royal Academy Exhibition of 1862. Upon this idea he proceeded, introduced the apparently simple but really most intricate process of machine combing, and after great labor he succeeded in perfecting the invention. The singular beauty of the process can only be appreciated by those who have witnessed the machine at work, when the similarity of its movements to that of combing the hair, which suggested the invention, is at once apparent. The machine has been described as acting with almost the delicacy of touch of the human fingers. It combs the lock of cotton at both ends, places the fibers exactly parallel with each other, separates the long from the short, and unites the long fibers in one sliver and the short ones in another. In fine, the machine not only acts with the delicate accuracy of the human fingers, but apparently with the delicate intelligence of the human mind. The chief commercial value of the invention consisted in its rendering the commoner sorts of cotton available for fine spinning. The manufacturers were thereby enabled to select the most suitable fibers for high-priced fabrics, and to produce the finer sorts of yarn in much larger quantities. It became possible by its means to make thread so fine that a length of 334 miles might be spun from a single pound weight of the prepared cotton, and, worked up into the finer sorts of lace, the original shilling's worth of cotton wool, before it passed into the hands of the consumer, might thus be increased to the value of between 300L and 400L sterling. The beauty and utility of Heilmann's invention were at once appreciated by the English cotton spinners. 6 Lancashire firms united and purchased the patent for cotton spinning for England for the sum of 30,000L. The wool spinners paid the same sum for the privilege of applying the process to wool, and the Messrs. Marshall, of Leeds, 20,000L. for the privilege of applying it to flax. Thus wealth suddenly flowed in upon poor Heilmann at last. But he did not live to enjoy it. Scarcely had his long labors been crowned by success than he died, and his son, who had shared in his privations, shortly followed him. It is at the price of lives such as these that the wonders of civilization are achieved. p. 67 Chapter 3 The Great Potters, Palissy, Botker, Wedgwood. Patience is the finest and worthiest part of fortitude, and the rarest too. Patience lies at the root of all pleasures, as well as of all powers. Hope herself ceases to be happiness when impatience companions her. John Ruskin. Ilya vingt et cinq ans passes tu il ennemi fut monstre en coupe de terre, tourni ets mêlé d'une telle butte que, deslors, sans avoir escard que j'en avoir nulle connaissance de terres argilieuses, j'ai mis à chercher les mots, comme un homme que taste en ténèbres. Bernard Palissy. It so happens that the history of pottery furnishes some of the most remarkable instances of patient perseverance to be found in the whole range of biography. Of these we select 3 of the most striking, as exhibited in the lives of Bernard Palissy, the Frenchman, Johann Friedrich Botker, the German, and Josiah Wedgwood, the Englishman. Though the art of making common vessels of clay was known to most of the ancient nations, that of manufacturing enameled earthenware was much less common. It was, however, practiced by the ancient Etruscans, specimens of whose ware are still to be found in antiquarian collections. But it became a lost art, and was only recovered at a comparatively recent date. The Etruscan ware was very valuable in ancient times, a vase being worth its weight in gold in the time of Augustus. The Moors seem to have preserved amongst them a knowledge of the art, which they were found practicing in the island of Majorca when it was taken by the Pisans in 1115. Among the spoil carried away were many plates of Moorish earthenware, which, in token of triumph, were embedded in the walls of several of the ancient churches of Pisa, where they are to be seen to this day. About 2 centuries later the Italians began to make an imitation enameled ware, which they named Majolica, after the Moorish place of manufacture. The reviver or rediscoverer of the art of enameling in Italy was Luca della Robbia, a Florentine sculptor. Vasari describes him as a man of indefatigable perseverance, working with his chisel all day and practicing drawing during the greater part of the night. He pursued the latter art with so much assiduity, that when working late, to prevent his feet from freezing with the cold, he was accustomed to provide himself with a basket of shavings, in which he placed them to keep himself warm and enable him to proceed with his drawings. Nor, says Vasari, am I in the least astonished at this, since no man ever becomes distinguished in any art whatsoever who does not early begin to acquire the power of supporting heat, cold, hunger, thirst, and other discomforts, whereas those persons deceive themselves altogether who suppose that when taking their ease and surrounded by all the enjoyments of the world they may still attain to honorable distinction, for it is not by sleeping, but by waking, watching, and law. T was the youngest son of a respectable small farmer at Duffield, Derbyshire, where he was born in 1783. When at school he made steady and rapid progress, but was early removed from it to be apprenticed to a framesmith near Loughborough. The boy soon learnt to handle tools with dexterity, and he acquired a minute knowledge of the parts of which the stocking frame was composed, as well as of the more intricate warp machine. At his leisure he studied how to introduce improvements in them, and his friend, Mr. Bazley, MP, states that as early as the age of 16, he conceived the idea of inventing a machine by which lace might be made similar to Buckingham or French lace, then all made by hand. The first practical improvement he succeeded in introducing was in the warp frame, when, by means of an ingenious apparatus, he succeeded in producing mitts of a lacy appearance, and it was this success which determined him to pursue the study of mechanical lace-making. The stocking frame had already, in a modified form, been applied to the manufacture of point-net lace, in which the mesh was looped as in a stocking, but the work was slight and frail, and therefore unsatisfactory. Many ingenious Nottingham mechanics had, during a long succession of years, been laboring at the problem of inventing a machine by which the mesh of threads should be twisted round each other on the formation of the net. Some of these men died in poverty, some were driven insane, and all alike failed in the object of their search. The old warp machine held its ground. When a little over 21 years of age, Heathcote went to Nottingham, where he readily found employment, for which he soon received the highest remuneration, as a setter-up of hosiery and warp frames, and was much respected for his talent for invention, general intelligence, and the sound and sober principles that governed his conduct. He also continued to pursue the subject on which his mind had before been occupied, and labored to compass the contrivance of a twist-traverse net machine. He first studied the art of making the Buckingham or pillow lace by hand, with the object of effecting the same motions by mechanical means. It was a long and laborious task, requiring the exercise of great perseverance and ingenuity. His master, Eliot, described him at that time as inventive, patient, self-denying, and taciturn, undaunted by failures and mistakes, full of resources and expedients, and entertaining the most perfect confidence that his application of mechanical principles would eventually be crowned with success. It is difficult to describe in words an invention so complicated as the bobbin net machine. It was, indeed, a mechanical pillow for making lace, imitating in an ingenious manner the motions of the lace-maker's fingers in intersecting or tying the meshes of the lace upon her pillow. On analyzing the component parts of a piece of handmade lace, Heathcote was enabled to classify the threads into longitudinal and diagonal. He began his experiments by fixing common pack threads lengthwise on a sort of frame for the warp, and then passing the weft threads between them by common pliers, delivering them to other pliers on the opposite side. Then, after giving them a sideways motion and twist, the threads were repassed back between the next adjoining cords, the meshes being thus tied in the same way as upon pillows by hand. He had then to contrive a mechanism that should accomplish all these nice and delicate movements, and to do this cost him no small amount of mental toil. Long after he said, the single difficulty of getting the diagonal threads to twist in the allotted space was so great that if it had now to be done, I should probably not attempt its accomplishment. His next step was to provide thin metallic discs, to be used as bobbins for conducting the threads backwards and forwards through the warp. These discs, being arranged in carrier frames placed on each side of the warp, were moved by suitable machinery so as to conduct the threads from side to side in forming the lace. He eventually succeeded in working out his principle with extraordinary skill and success, and, at the age of 24, he was enabled to secure his invention by a patent. During this time his wife was kept in almost as great anxiety as himself, for she well knew of his trials and difficulties while he was striving to perfect his invention. Many years after they had been successfully overcome, the conversation which took place one eventful evening was vividly remembered. "Well," said the anxious wife, "will it work?" "No," was the sad answer, "I have had to take it all to pieces again." Though he could still speak hopefully and cheerfully, his poor wife could restrain her feelings no longer, but sat down and cried bitterly. She had, however, only a few more weeks to wait, for success long labored for and richly deserved, came at last, and a proud and happy man was John Heathcote when he brought home the first narrow strip of bobbin net made by his machine, and placed it in the hands of his wife. As in the case of nearly all inventions which have proved productive, Heathcote's rights as a patentee were disputed, and his claims as an inventor called in question. On the supposed invalidity of the patent, the lace-makers boldly adopted the bobbin net machine, and set the inventor at defiance. But other patents were taken out for alleged improvements and adaptations, and it was only when these new patentees fell out and went to law with each other that Heathcote's rights became established. One lace manufacturer having brought an action against another for an alleged infringement of his patent, the jury brought in a verdict for the defendant, in which the judge concurred, on the ground that both the machines in question were infringements of Heathcote's patent. It was on the occasion of this trial, Boville versus Moore, that Sir John Copley, afterwards Lord Lyndhurst, who was retained for the defence in the interest of Mr. Heathcote, learnt to work the bobbin net machine in order that he might master the details of the invention. On reading over his brief, he confessed that he did not quite understand the merits of the case, but as it seemed to him to be one of great importance, he offered to go down into the country forthwith and study the machine until he understood it, and then, said he, "I will defend you to the best of my ability." He accordingly put himself into that night's mail, and went down to Nottingham to get up his case as perhaps counsel never got it up before. Next morning the learned sergeant placed himself in a lace loom, and he did not leave it until he could deftly make a piece of bobbin net with his own hands, and thoroughly understood the principle as well as the details of the machine. When the case came on for trial, the learned sergeant was enabled to work the model on the table with such case and skill, and to explain the precise nature of the invention with such felicitous clearness, as to astonish alike judge, jury, and spectators, and the thorough conscientiousness and mastery with which he handled the case had no doubt its influence upon the decision of the court. After the trial was over, Mr. Heathcote, on inquiry, found about 600 machines at work after his patent, and he proceeded to levy royalty upon the owners of them, which amounted to a large sum. But the profits realized by the manufacturers of lace were very great, and the use of the machines rapidly extended, while the price of the article was reduced from £5 the square yard to about 5 pence in the course of 25 years. During the same period the average annual returns of the lace trade have been at least 4 millions sterling, and it gives remunerative employment to about 150,000 workpeople. To return to the personal history of Mr. Heathcote. In 1809 we find him established as a lace manufacturer at Loughborough, in Leicestershire. There he carried on a prosperous business for several years, giving employment to a large number of operatives, at wages varying from 5l. to 10l. a week. Notwithstanding the great increase in the number of hands employed in lace-making through the introduction of the new machines, it began to be whispered about among the workpeople that they were superseding labor, and an extensive conspiracy was formed for the purpose of destroying them wherever found. As early as the year 1811 disputes arose between the masters and men engaged in the stocking and lace trades in the southwestern parts of Nottinghamshire and the adjacent parts of Derbyshire and Leicestershire, the result of which was the assembly of a mob at Sutton, in Ashfield, who proceeded in open day to break the stocking and lace frames of the manufacturers. Some of the ringleaders having been seized and punished, the disaffected learnt caution. But the destruction of the machines was nevertheless carried on secretly wherever a safe opportunity presented itself. As the machines were of so delicate a construction that a single blow of a hammer rendered them useless, and as the manufacture was carried on for the most part in detached buildings, often in private dwellings remote from towns, the opportunities of destroying them were unusually easy. In the neighborhood of Nottingham, which was the focus of turbulence, the machine breakers organized themselves in regular bodies, and held nocturnal meetings at which their plans were arranged. Probably with the view of inspiring confidence, they gave out that they were under the command of a leader named Ned Ludd, or General Ludd, and hence their designation of Luddites. Under this organization machine breaking was carried on with great vigor during the winter of 1811, occasioning great distress, and throwing large numbers of workpeople out of employment. Meanwhile, the owners of the frames proceeded to remove them from the villages and lone dwellings in the country, and brought them into warehouses in the towns for their better protection. The Luddites seem to have been encouraged by the lenity of the sentences pronounced on such of their confederates as had been apprehended and tried, and, shortly after, the mania broke out afresh, and rapidly extended over the northern and midland manufacturing districts. The organization became more secret, an oath was administered to the members binding them to obedience to the orders issued by the heads of the Confederacy, and the betrayal of their designs was decreed to be death. All machines were doomed by them to destruction, whether employed in the manufacture of cloth, calico, or lace, and a reign of terror began which lasted for years. In Yorkshire and Lancashire mills were boldly attacked by armed rioters, and in many cases they were wrecked or burnt, so that it became necessary to guard them by soldiers and yeomanry. The masters themselves were doomed to death, many of them were assaulted, and some were murdered. At length the law was vigorously set in motion. Numbers of the misguided Luddites were apprehended, some were executed, and after several years' violent commotion from this cause, the machine-breaking riots were at length quelled. Among the numerous manufacturers whose works were attacked by the Luddites, was the inventor of the bobbin net machine himself. One bright sunny day, in the summer of 1816, a body of rioters entered his factory at Loughborough with torches, and set fire to it, destroying 37 lace machines, and above 10,000 L worth of property. 10 of the men were apprehended for the felony, and 8 of them were executed. Mr. Heathcote made a claim upon the county for compensation, and it was resisted, but the Court of Queen's Bench decided in his favour, and decreed that the county must make good his loss of 10,000 L. The magistrate sought to couple with the payment of the damage the condition that Mr. Heathcote should expend the money in the county of Leicester, but to this he would not assent, having already resolved on removing his manufacture elsewhere. At Tiverton, in Devonshire, he found a large building which had been formerly used as a woolen manufactory. But the Tiverton cloth trade having fallen into decay, the building remained unoccupied, and the town itself was generally in a very poverty-stricken condition. Mr. Heathcote bought the old mill, renovated and enlarged it, and there recommenced the manufacture of lace upon a larger scale than before, keeping in full work as many as 300 machines, and employing a large number of artisans at good wages. Not only did he carry on the manufacture of lace, but the various branches of business connected with it, yarn doubling, silk spinning, net making, and finishing. He also established at Tiverton an iron foundry and works for the manufacture of agricultural implements, which proved of great convenience to the district. It was a favorite idea of his that steam power was capable of being applied to perform all the heavy drudgery of life, and he labored for a long time at the invention of a steam plow. In 1832 he so far completed his invention as to be enabled to take out a patent for it, and Heathcote's steam plow, though it has since been superseded by Fowler's, was considered the best machine of the kind that had up to that time been invented. Mr. Heathcote was a man of great natural gifts. He possessed a sound understanding, quick perception, and a genius for business of the highest order. With these he combined uprightness, honesty, and integrity, qualities which are the true glory of human character. Himself a diligent self-educator, he gave ready encouragement to deserving youths in his employment, stimulating their talents and fostering their energies. During his own busy life, he contrived to save time to master French and Italian, of which he acquired an accurate and grammatical knowledge. His mind was largely stored with the results of a careful study of the best literature, and there were few subjects on which he had not formed for himself shrewd and accurate views. The 2,000 workpeople in his employment regarded him almost as a father, and he carefully provided for their comfort and improvement. Prosperity did not spoil him, as it does so many, nor close his heart against the claims of the poor and struggling, who were always sure of his sympathy and help. To provide for the education of the children of his workpeople, he built schools for them at a cost of about 6,000 L. He was also a man of singularly cheerful and buoyant disposition, a favorite with men of all classes and most admired and beloved by those who knew him best. In 1831 the electors of Tiverton, of which town Mr. Heathcote had proved himself so genuine a benefactor, returned him to represent them in Parliament, and he continued their member for nearly 30 years. During a great part of that time he had Lord Palmerston for his colleague, and the noble lord, on more than one public occasion, expressed the high regard which he entertained for his venerable friend. On retiring from the representation in 1859, owing to advancing age and increasing infirmities, 1,300 of his workmen presented him with a silver inkstand and gold pen, in token of their esteem. He enjoyed his leisure for only 2 more years, dying in January, 1861, at the age of 77, and leaving behind him a character for probity, virtue, manliness, and mechanical genius, of which his descendants may well be proud. We next turn to a career of a very different kind, that of the illustrious but unfortunate Jacquard, whose life also illustrates in a remarkable manner the influence which ingenious men, even of the humblest rank, may exercise upon the industry of a nation. Jacquard was the son of a hard-working couple of Lyons, his father being a weaver, and his mother a pattern reader. They were too poor to give him any but the most meager education. When he was of age to learn a trade, his father placed him with a bookbinder. An old clerk, who made up the master's accounts, gave Jacquard some lessons in mathematics. He very shortly began to display a remarkable turn for mechanics, and some of his contrivances quite astonished the old clerk, who advised Jacquard's father to put him to some other trade, in which his peculiar abilities might have better scope than in bookbinding. He was accordingly put apprentice to a cutler, but was so badly treated by his master, that he shortly afterwards left his employment, on which he was placed with a type founder. His parents dying, Jacquard found himself in a measure compelled to take to his father's 2 looms, and carry on the trade of a weaver. He immediately proceeded to improve the looms, and became so engrossed with his inventions that he forgot his work, and very soon found himself at the end of his means. He then sold the looms to pay his debts, at the same time that he took upon himself the burden of supporting a wife. He became still poorer, and to satisfy his creditors, he next sold his cottage. He tried to find employment, but in vain, people believing him to be an idler, occupied with mere dreams about his inventions. At length he obtained employment with a line-maker of Bresse, whither he went, his wife remaining at Lyons, earning a precarious living by making straw bonnets. We hear nothing further of Jacquard for some years, but in the interval he seems to have prosecuted his improvement in the draw-loom for the better manufacture of figured fabrics, for, in 1790, he brought out his contrivance for selecting the warp threads, which, when added to the loom, superseded the services of a drawboy. The adoption of this machine was slow but steady, and in 10 years after its introduction, 4,000 of them were found at work in Lyons. Jacquard's pursuits were rudely interrupted by the Revolution, and, in 1792, we find him fighting in the ranks of the Lyonnese volunteers against the army of the Convention under the command of Dubois-Craintes. The city was taken, Jacquard fled and joined the army of the Rhine, where he rose to the rank of sergeant. He might have remained a soldier, but that, his only son having been shot dead at his side, he deserted and returned to Lyons to recover his wife. He found her in a garret still employed at her old trade of straw bonnet making. While living in concealment with her, his mind reverted to the inventions over which he had so long brooded in former years, but he had no means wherewith to prosecute them. Jacquard found it necessary, however, to emerge from his hiding place and try to find some employment. He succeeded in obtaining it with an intelligent manufacturer, and while working by day he went on inventing by night. It had occurred to him that great improvements might still be introduced in looms for figured goods, and he incidentally mentioned the subject one day to his master, regretting at the same time that his limited means prevented him from carrying out his ideas. Happily his master appreciated the value of the suggestions, and with laudable generosity placed a sum of money at his disposal, that he might prosecute the proposed improvements at his leisure. In 3 months Jacquard had invented a loom to substitute mechanical action for the irksome and toilsome labor of the workman. The loom was exhibited at the Exposition of National Industry at Paris in 1801, and obtained a bronze medal. Jacquard was further honored by a visit at Lyons from the minister Carnot, who desired to congratulate him in person on the success of his invention. In the following year the Society of Arts in London offered a prize for the invention of a machine for manufacturing fishing nets and boarding netting for ships. Jacquard heard of this, and while walking one day in the fields according to his custom, he turned the subject over in his mind, and contrived the force of character, indomitable courage, much worldly shrewdness, with a business faculty almost amounting to genius. At one period his time was engrossed by severe and continuous labor, occasioned by the organizing and conducting of his numerous manufactories, sometimes from 4 in the morning till 9 at night. At 50 years of age he set to work to learn English grammar, and improve himself in writing and orthography. After overcoming every obstacle, he had the satisfaction of reaping the reward of his enterprise. 18 years after he had constructed his first machine, he rose to such estimation in Derbyshire that he was appointed High Sheriff of the county, and shortly after George III conferred upon him the honor of knighthood. He died in 1792. Be it for good or for evil, Arkwright was the founder in England of the modern factory system, a branch of industry which has unquestionably proved a source of immense wealth to individuals and to the nation. All the other great branches of industry in Britain furnish like examples of energetic men of business, the source of much benefit to the neighbourhoods in which they have laboured, and of increased power and wealth to the community at large. Amongst such might be cited the Struts of Belper, the Tennants of Glasgow, the Marshalls and Gotts of Leeds, the Peels, Ashworths, Burleys, Fieldons, Ashtons, Haywoods, and Ainsworths of South Lancashire, some of whose descendants have since become distinguished in connection with the political history of England. Such preeminently were the Peels of South Lancashire. The founder of the Peel family, about the middle of last century, was a small yeoman, occupying the Whole House farm, near Blackburn, from which he afterwards removed to a house situated in Fish Lane in that town. Robert Peel, as he advanced in life, saw a large family of sons and daughters growing up about him, but the land about Blackburn being somewhat barren, it did not appear to him that agricultural pursuits offered a very encouraging prospect for their industry. The place had, however, long been the seat of a domestic manufacture, the fabric called Blackburn Greys, consisting of linen weft and cotton warp, being chiefly made in that town and its neighbourhood. It was then customary, previous to the introduction of the factory system, for industrious yeomen with families to employ the time not occupied in the fields in weaving at home, and Robert Peel accordingly began the domestic trade of calico making. He was honest, and made an honest article. Thrifty and hard-working, and his trade prospered. He was also enterprising, and was one of the first to adopt the carding cylinder, then recently invented. But Robert Peel's attention was principally directed to the printing of calico, then a comparatively unknown art, and for some time he carried on a series of experiments with the object of printing by machinery. The experiments were secretly conducted in his own house, the cloth being ironed for the purpose by one of the women of the family. It was then customary, in such houses as the Peels, to use pewter plates at dinner. Having sketched a figure or pattern on one of the plates, the thought struck him that an impression might be got from it in reverse, and printed on calico with color. In a cottage at the end of the farmhouse lived a woman who kept a calendaring machine, and going into her cottage, he put the plate with color rubbed into the figured part and some calico over it, through the machine, when it was found to leave a satisfactory impression. Such is said to have been the origin of roller printing on calico. Robert Peel shortly perfected his process, and the first pattern he brought out was a parsley leaf. Hence he is spoken of in the neighborhood of Blackburn to this day as Parsley Peel. The process of calico printing by what is called the mule machine, that is, by means of a wooden cylinder in relief, with an engraved copper cylinder, was afterwards brought to perfection by one of his sons, the head of the firm of Messrs. Peel and Company, of Church. Stimulated by his success, Robert Peel shortly gave up farming, and removing to Brookside, a village about 2 miles from Blackburn, he devoted himself exclusively to the printing business. There, with the aid of his sons, who were as energetic as himself, he successfully carried on the trade for several years. And as the young men grew up towards manhood, the concern branched out into various firms of Peels, each of which became a center of industrial activity and a source of remunerative employment to large numbers of people. From what can now be learned of the character of the original and untitled Robert Peel, he must have been a remarkable man, shrewd, sagacious, and far-seeing. But little is known of him excepting from traditions, and the sons of those who knew him are fast passing away. His son, Sir Robert, thus modestly spoke of him: "My father may be truly said to have been the founder of our family, and he so accurately appreciated the importance of commercial wealth in a national point of view, that he was often heard to say that the gains to individuals were small compared with the national gains arising from trade." Sir Robert Peel, the first baronet and the second manufacturer of the name, inherited all his father's enterprise, ability, and industry. His position, at starting in life, was little above that of an ordinary working man, for his father, though laying the foundations of future prosperity, was still struggling with the difficulties arising from insufficient capital. When Robert was only 20 years of age, he determined to begin the business of cotton printing, which he had by this time learnt from his father, on his own account. His uncle, James Hayworth, and William Yates of Blackburn, joined him in his enterprise. The whole capital which they could raise amongst them amounting to only about 500L, the principal part of which was supplied by William Yates. The father of the latter was a householder in Blackburn, where he was well known and much respected, and having saved money by his business, he was willing to advance sufficient to give his son a start in the lucrative trade of cotton printing, then in its infancy. Robert Peel, though comparatively a mere youth, supplied the practical knowledge of the business, but it was said of him, and proved true, that he carried an old head on young shoulders. A ruined corn mill, with its adjoining fields, was purchased for a comparatively small sum, near the then insignificant town of Bury, where the works long after continued to be known as the Ground. And a few wooden sheds having been run up, the firm commenced their cotton printing business in a very humble way in the year 1770, adding to it that of cotton spinning a few years later. The frugal style in which the partners lived may be inferred from the following incident in their early career. William Yates, being a married man with a family, commenced housekeeping on a small scale, and, to oblige Peel, who was single, he agreed to take him as a lodger. The sum which the latter first paid for board and lodging was only 8s a week, but Yates, considering this too little, insisted on the weekly payment being increased a shilling, to which Peel at first demurred, and a difference between the partners took place, which was eventually compromised by the lodger paying an advance of 6 pence a week. William Yates's eldest child was a girl named Ellen, and she very soon became an especial favorite with the young lodger. On returning from his hard day's work at the ground, he would take the little girl upon his knee, and say to her, "Nelly, thou bonny little dear, wilt be my wife?" To which the child would readily answer, "Yes," as any child would do. "Then I'll wait for thee, Nelly, I'll wed thee, and none else." And Robert Peel did wait. As the girl grew in beauty towards womanhood, his determination to wait for her was strengthened, and after the lapse of 10 years of close application to business and rapidly increasing prosperity, Robert Peel married Ellen Yates when she had completed her 17th year, and the pretty child, whom her mother's lodger and father's partner had nursed upon his knee, became Mrs. Peel, and eventually Lady Peel, the mother of the future Prime Minister of England. Lady Peel was a noble and beautiful woman, fitted to grace any station in life. She possessed rare powers of mind, and was, on every emergency, the high-souled and faithful counselor of her husband. For many years after their marriage, she acted as his amanuensis, conducting the principal part of his business correspondence, for Mr. Peel himself was an indifferent and almost unintelligible writer. She died in 1803, only 3 years after the baronetcy had been conferred upon her husband. It is said that London fashionable life, so unlike what she had been accustomed to at home, proved injurious to her health, and old Mr. Yates afterwards used to say, "If Robert hadn't made our Nelly a lady, she might ha' been living yet." The career of Yates, Peel, and Company, was throughout one of great and uninterrupted prosperity. Sir Robert Peel himself was the soul of the firm, to great energy and application uniting much practical sagacity, and first-rate mercantile abilities. Qualities in which many of the early cotton spinners were exceedingly deficient. He was a man of iron mind and frame, and toiled unceasingly. In short, he was to cotton printing what Arkwright was to cotton spinning, and his success was equally great. The excellence of the articles produced by the firm secured the command of the market, and the character of the firm stood preeminent in Lancashire. Besides greatly benefiting Bury, the partnership planted similar extensive works in the neighbourhood, on the Irwell and the Rock, and it was cited to their honour, that, while they sought to raise to the highest perfection the quality of their manufactures, they also endeavoured, in all ways, to promote the well-being and comfort of their workpeople, for whom they contrived to provide remunerative employment even in the least prosperous times. Sir Robert Peel readily appreciated the value of all new processes and inventions, in illustration of which we may allude to his adoption of the process for producing what is called resist work in calico printing. This is accomplished by the use of a paste, or resist, on such parts of the cloth as were intended to remain white. The person who discovered the paste was a traveller for a London house, who sold it to Mr. Peel for an inconsiderable sum. It required the experience of a year or two to perfect the system and make it practically useful, but the beauty of its effect, and the extreme precision of outline in the pattern produced, at once placed the Bury establishment at the head of all the factories for calico printing in the country. Other firms, conducted with like spirit, were established by members of the same family at Burnley, Foxhill Bank, and Altham, in Lancashire, Sally Abbey, in Yorkshire, and afterwards at Burton-on-Trent, in Staffordshire. These various establishments, whilst they brought wealth to their proprietors, setting an example to the whole cotton trade, and training up many of the most successful printers and manufacturers in Lancashire. Among other distinguished founders of industry, the Rev. William Lee, inventor of the stocking frame, and John Heathcote, inventor of the bobbin net machine, are worthy of notice, as men of great mechanical skill and perseverance, through whose labours a vast amount of remunerative employment has been provided for the labouring population of Nottingham and the adjacent districts. The accounts which have been preserved of the circumstances connected with the invention of the stocking frame are very confused, and in many respects contradictory, though there is no doubt as to the name of the inventor. This was William Lee, born at Woodborough, a village some 7 miles from Nottingham, about the year 1563. According to some accounts, he was the heir to a small freehold, while according to others he was a poor scholar, 43a, and had to struggle with poverty from his earliest years. He entered as a sizar at Christ College, Cambridge, in May, 1579, and subsequently removed to St. John's, taking his degree of B.A. in 1582-3. It is believed that he commenced M.A. in 1586, but on this point there appears to be some confusion in the records of the university. The statement usually made that he was expelled for marrying contrary to the statutes is incorrect, as he was never a fellow of the university, and therefore could not be prejudiced by taking such a step. At the time when Lee invented the stocking frame he was officiating as curate of Calverton, near Nottingham, and it is alleged by some writers that the invention had its origin in disappointed affection. The curate is said to have fallen deeply in love with a young lady of the village, who failed to reciprocate his affections, and when he visited her, she was accustomed to pay much more attention to the process of knitting stockings and instructing her pupils in the art, than to the addresses of her admirer. This slight is said to have created in his mind such an aversion to knitting by hand, that he formed the determination to invent a machine that should supersede it and render it a gainless employment. For 3 years he devoted himself to the prosecution of the invention, sacrificing everything to his new idea. At the prospect of success opened before him, he abandoned his curacy, and devoted himself to the art of stocking making by machinery. This is the version of the story given by Henson, 43b, on the authority of an old stocking maker, who died in Collins's Hospital, Nottingham, aged 92, and was apprenticed in the town during the reign of Queen Anne. It is also given by Deering and Blackner as the traditional account in the neighbourhood, and it is in some measure borne out by the arms of the London Company of Framework Knitters, which consists of a stocking frame without the woodwork, with a clergyman on one side and a woman on the other as supporters. 44. Whatever may have been the actual facts as to the origin of the invention of the stocking loom, there can be no doubt as to the extraordinary mechanical genius displayed by its inventor. That a clergyman living in a remote village, whose life had for the most part been spent with books, should contrive a machine of such delicate and complicated movements, and at once advance the art of knitting from the tedious process of linking threads in a chain of loops by 3 skewers in the fingers of a woman, to the beautiful and rapid process of weaving by the stocking frame, was indeed an astonishing achievement, which may be pronounced almost unequaled in the history of mechanical invention. Lee's merit was all the greater, as the handicraft arts were then in their infancy, and little attention had as yet been given to the contrivance of machinery for the purposes of manufacture. He was under the necessity of extemporizing the parts of his machine as he best could, and adopting various expedients to overcome difficulties as they arose. His tools were imperfect, and his materials imperfect, and he had no skilled workmen to assist him. According to tradition, the first frame he made was a 12-gauge, without lead sinkers, and it was almost wholly of wood, the needles being also stuck in bits of wood. One of Lee's principal difficulties consisted in the formation of the stitch, for want of needle eyes, but this he eventually overcame by forming eyes to the needles with a 3-square file. 45. At length, one difficulty after another was successfully overcome, and after 3 years' labor the machine was sufficiently complete to be fit for use. The quondam curate, full of enthusiasm for his art, now began stocking weaving in the village of Calverton, and he continued to work there for several years, instructing his brother James and several of his relations in the practice of the art. Having brought his frame to a considerable degree of perfection, and being desirous of securing the patronage of Queen Elizabeth, whose partiality for knitted silk stockings was well known, Lee proceeded to London to exhibit the loom before Her Majesty. He first showed it to several members of the court, among others to Sir William, afterwards Lord, Hunsdon, whom he taught to work it with success. And Lee was, through their instrumentality, at length admitted to an interview with the Queen, and worked the machine in her presence. Elizabeth, however, did not give him the encouragement that he had expected, and she is said to have opposed the invention on the ground that it was calculated to deprive a large number of poor people of their employment of hand knitting. Lee was no more successful in finding other patrons, and considering himself and his invention treated with contempt, he embraced the offer made to him by Sully, the sagacious minister of Henry IV, to proceed to Rouen and instruct the operatives of that town, then one of the most important manufacturing centres of France, in the construction and use of the stocking frame. Lee accordingly transferred himself and his machines to France, in 1605, taking with him his brother and 7 workmen. He met with a cordial reception at Rouen, and was proceeding with the manufacture of stockings on a large scale, having 9 of his frames in full work, when unhappily ill fortune again overtook him. Henry IV, his protector, on whom he had relied for the rewards, honors, and promised grant of privileges, which had induced Lee to settle in France, was murdered by the fanatic Ravaillac, and the encouragement and protection which had heretofore been extended to him were at once withdrawn. To press his claims at court, Lee proceeded to Paris, but being a Protestant as well as a foreigner, his representations were treated with neglect, and worn out with vexation and grief. This distinguished inventor shortly after died at Paris, in a state of extreme poverty and distress. Lee's brother, with 7 of the workmen, succeeded in escaping from France with their frames, leaving 2 behind. On James Lee's return to Nottinghamshire, he was joined by one Ashton, a miller of Thoroton, who had been instructed in the art of framework knitting by the inventor himself before he left England. These 2, with the workmen and their frames, began the stocking manufacture at Thoroton, and carried it on with considerable success. The place was favourably situated for the purpose, as the sheep pastured in the neighbouring district of Sherwood yielded a kind of wool of the longest staple. Ashton is said to have introduced the method of making the frames with lead sinkers, which was a great improvement. The number of looms employed in different parts of England gradually increased, and the machine manufacture of stockings eventually became an important branch of the national industry. One of the most important modifications in the stocking frame was that which enabled it to be applied to the manufacture of lace on a large scale. In 1777, 2 workmen, Frost and Holmes, were both engaged in making point net by means of the modifications they had introduced in the stocking frame, and in the course of about 30 years, so rapid was the growth of this branch of production that 1,500 point net frames were at work, giving employment to upwards of 15,000 people. Owing, however, to the war, to change of fashion, and to other circumstances, the Nottingham lace manufacture rapidly fell off. And it continued in a decaying state until the invention of the bobbin net machine by John Heathcote, late MP for Tiverton, which had the effect of at once re-establishing the manufacture on solid foundations. John Heathcote's influence exercises a genuine effect upon my own. Many others have influence upon the details of my actions, but no one has so much influence as thou on the origination of fundamental ideas, and of those principles which are the rule of conduct. De Tocqueville was not less ready to confess the great obligations which he owed to his wife, Marie, for the preservation of that temper and frame of mind which enabled him to prosecute his studies with success. He believed that a noble-minded woman insensibly elevated the character of her husband, while one of a grovelling nature as certainly tended to degrade it. 26. In fine, human character is moulded by 1,000 subtle influences, by example and precept, by life and literature, by friends and neighbors, by the world we live in as well as by the spirits of our forefathers, whose legacy of good words and deeds we inherit. But great, unquestionably, though these influences are acknowledged to be, it is nevertheless equally clear that men must necessarily be the active agents of their own well-being and well-doing, and that, however much the wise and the good may owe to others, they themselves must in the very nature of things be their own best helpers. p. 27 Chapter 2. Leaders of industry, inventors and producers. Le travail et la science sont désormais les maîtres du monde. De Salvandi. Deduct all that men of the humbler classes have done for England in the way of inventions only, and see where she would have been but for them. Arthur Helps. One of the most strongly marked features of the English people is their spirit of industry, standing out prominent and distinct in their past history, and as strikingly characteristic of them now as at any former period. It is this spirit, displayed by the Commons of England, which has laid the foundations and built up the industrial greatness of the empire. This vigorous growth of the nation has been mainly the result of the free energy of individuals, and it has been contingent upon the number of hands and minds from time to time actively employed within it, whether as cultivators of the soil, producers of articles of utility, contrivers of tools and machines, writers of books, or creators of works of art. And while this spirit of active industry has been the vital principle of the nation, it has also been its saving and remedial one, counteracting from time to time the effects of errors in our laws and imperfections in our Constitution. The career of industry which the nation has pursued, has also proved its best education. As steady application to work is the healthiest training for every individual, so is it the best discipline of a state. Honorable industry travels the same road with duty. And Providence has closely linked both with happiness. The gods, says the poet, have placed labor and toil on the way leading to the Elysian fields. Certain it is that no bread eaten by man is so sweet as that earned by his own labor, whether bodily or mental. By labor the earth has been subdued, and man redeemed from barbarism, nor has a single step in civilization been made without it. Labor is not only a necessity and a duty, but a blessing, only the idler feels it to be a curse. The duty of work is written on the thews and muscles of the limbs, the mechanism of the hand, the nerves and lobes of the brain, the sum of whose healthy action is satisfaction and enjoyment. In the school of labor is taught the best practical wisdom, nor is a life of manual employment, as we shall hereafter find, incompatible with high mental culture. Hugh Miller, than whom none knew better the strength and the weakness belonging to the lot of labor, stated the result of his experience to be, that work, even the hardest, is full of pleasure and materials for self-improvement. He held honest labor to be the best of teachers, and that the school of toil is the noblest of schools, save only the Christian one. That it is a school in which the ability of being useful is imparted, the spirit of independence learnt, and the habit of persevering effort acquired. He was even of opinion that the training of the mechanic, by the exercise which it gives to his observant faculties, from his daily dealing with things actual and practical, and the close experience of life which he acquires, better fits him for picking his way along the journey of life, and is more favorable to his growth as a man, emphatically speaking, than the training afforded by any other condition. The array of great names which we have already cursorily cited, of men springing from the ranks of the industrial classes, who have achieved distinction in various walks of life, in science, commerce, literature, and art, shows that at all events the difficulties interposed by poverty and labor are not insurmountable. As respects the great contrivances and inventions which have conferred so much power and wealth upon the nation, it is unquestionable that for the greater part of them we have been indebted to men of the humblest rank. Deduct what they have done in this particular line of action, and it will be found that very little indeed remains for other men to have accomplished. Inventors have set in motion some of the greatest industries of the world. To them society owes many of its chief necessaries, comforts, and luxuries, and by their genius and labor daily life has been rendered in all respects more easy as well as enjoyable. Our food, our clothing, the furniture of our homes, the glass which admits the light to our dwellings at the same time that it excludes the cold, the gas which illuminates our streets, our means of locomotion by land and by sea, the tools by which our various articles of necessity and luxury are fabricated, have been the result of the labor and ingenuity of many men and many minds. Mankind at large are all the happier for such inventions, and are every day reaping the benefit of them in an increase of individual well-being as well as of public enjoyment. Though the invention of the working steam engine, the king of machines, belongs, comparatively speaking, to our own epoch, the idea of it was born many centuries ago. Like other contrivances and discoveries, it was effected step by step. One man transmitting the result of his labors, at the time apparently useless, to his successors, who took it up and carried it forward another stage, the prosecution of the inquiry extending over many generations. Thus the idea promulgated by Hero of Alexandria was never altogether lost, but, like the grain of wheat hid in the hand of the Egyptian mummy, it sprouted and again grew vigorously when brought into the full light of modern science. The steam engine was nothing, however, until it emerged from the state of theory, and was taken in hand by practical mechanics, and what a noble story of patient, laborious investigation, of difficulties encountered and overcome by heroic industry, does not that marvelous machine tell of? It is indeed, in itself, a monument of the power of self-help in man. Grouped around it we find Savary, the military engineer, Newcomen, the Dartmouth blacksmith, Colley, the glazier, Potter, the engine boy. Smeaton, the civil engineer, and, towering above all, the laborious, patient, never-tiring James Watt, the mathematical instrument maker. Watt was one of the most industrious of men, and the story of his life proves, what all experience confirms, that it is not the man of the greatest natural vigor and capacity who achieves the highest results, but he who employs his powers with the greatest industry and the most carefully disciplined skill. The skill that comes by labor, application, and experience. Many men in his time knew far more than Watt, but none labored so assiduously as he did to turn all that he did know to useful practical purposes. He was, above all things, most persevering in the pursuit of facts. He cultivated carefully that habit of active attention on which all the higher working qualities of the mind mainly depend. Indeed, Mr. Edgeworth entertained the opinion, that the difference of intellect in men depends more upon the early cultivation of this habit of attention, than upon any great disparity between the powers of one individual and another. Even when a boy, Watt found science in his toys. The quadrants lying about his father's carpenter's shop led him to the study of optics and astronomy, his ill health induced him to pry into the secrets of physiology. And his solitary walks through the country attracted him to the study of botany and history. While carrying on the business of a mathematical instrument maker, he received an order to build an organ, and, though without an ear for music, he undertook the study of harmonics, and successfully constructed the instrument. And, in like manner, when the little model of Newcomen's steam engine, belonging to the University of Glasgow, was placed in his hands to repair, he forthwith set himself to learn all that was then known about heat, evaporation, and condensation, at the same time plodding his way in mechanics and the science of construction, the results of which he at length embodied in his condensing steam engine. For 10 years he went on contriving and inventing, with little hope to cheer him, and with few friends to encourage him. He went on, meanwhile, earning bread for his family by making and selling quadrants, making and mending fiddles, flutes, and musical instruments, measuring mason work, surveying roads, superintending the construction of canals, or doing anything that turned up, and offered a prospect of honest gain. At length, Watt found a fit partner in another eminent leader of industry, Matthew Boulton, of Birmingham. A skillful, energetic, and far-seeing man, who vigorously undertook the enterprise of introducing the condensing engine into general use as a working power, and the success of both is now matter of history. 31. Many skillful inventors have from time to time added new power to the steam engine, and, by numerous modifications, rendered it capable of being applied to nearly all the purposes of manufacture. Driving machinery, impelling ships, grinding corn, printing books, stamping money, hammering, planing, and turning iron, in short, of performing every description of mechanical labor where power is required. One of the most useful modifications in the engine was that devised by Trevithick, and eventually perfected by George Stephenson and his son, in the form of the railway locomotive, by which social changes of immense importance have been brought about, of even greater consequence, considered in their results on human progress and civilization, than the condensing engine of Watt. One of the first grand results of Watt's invention, which placed an almost unlimited power at the command of the producing classes, was the establishment of the cotton manufacture. The person most closely identified with the foundation of this great branch of industry was unquestionably Sir Richard Arkwright, whose practical energy and sagacity were perhaps even more remarkable than his mechanical inventiveness. His originality as an inventor has indeed been called in question, like that of Watt and Stephenson. Arkwright probably stood in the same relation to the spinning machine that Watt did to the steam engine and Stephenson to the locomotive. He gathered together the scattered threads of ingenuity which already existed, and wove them, after his own design, into a new and original fabric. Though Lewis Paul, of Birmingham, patented the invention of spinning by rollers 30 years before Arkwright, the machines constructed by him were so imperfect in their details, that they could not be profitably worked, and the invention was practically a failure. Another obscure mechanic, a reed maker of Lee, named Thomas Hayes, is also said to have invented the water frame and spinning jenny, but they, too, proved unsuccessful. When the demands of industry are found to press upon the resources of inventors, the same idea is usually found floating about in many minds, such has been the case with the steam engine, the safety lamp, the electric telegraph, and other inventions. Many ingenious minds are found laboring in the throes of invention, until at length the master mind, the strong practical man, steps forward, and straightway delivers them of their idea, applies the principle successfully, and the thing is done. Then there is a loud outcry among all the smaller contrivers, who see themselves distanced in the race, and hence men such as Watt, Stephenson, and Arkwright, have usually to defend their reputation and their rights as practical and successful inventors. Richard Arkwright, like most of our great mechanicians, sprang from the ranks. He was born in Preston in 1732. His parents were very poor, and he was the youngest of 13 children. He was never at school. The only education he received he gave to himself, and to the last he was only able to write with difficulty. When a boy, he was apprenticed to a barber, and after learning the business, he set up for himself in Bolton, where he occupied an underground cellar, over which he put up the sign, "Come to the subterraneous barber, he shaves for a penny." The other barbers found their customers leaving them, and reduced their prices to his standard, when Arkwright, determined to push his trade, announced his determination to give a clean shave for a halfpenny. After a few years he quitted his cellar, and became an itinerant dealer in hair. At that time wigs were worn, and wig-making formed an important branch of the barbering business. Arkwright went about buying hair for the wigs. He was accustomed to attend the hiring fairs throughout Lancashire resorted to by young women, for the purpose of securing their long tresses, and it is said that in negotiations of this sort he was very successful. He also dealt in a chemical hair dye, which he used adroitly, and thereby secured a considerable trade. But he does not seem, notwithstanding his pushing character, to have done more than earn a bare living. The fashion of wig-wearing having undergone a change, distress fell upon the wig-makers, and Arkwright, being of a mechanical turn, was consequently induced to turn machine inventor or conjurer, as the pursuit was then popularly termed. Many attempts were made about that time to invent a spinning machine, and our barber determined to launch his little bark on the sea of invention with the rest. Like other self-taught men of the same bias, he had already been devoting his spare time to the invention of a perpetual motion machine, and from that the transition to a spinning machine was easy. He followed his experiments so assiduously that he neglected his business, lost the little money he had saved, and was reduced to great poverty. His wife, for he had by this time married, was impatient at what she conceived to be a wanton waste of time and money, and in a moment of sudden wrath she seized upon and destroyed his models, hoping thus to remove the cause of the family privations. Arkwright was a stubborn and enthusiastic man, and he was provoked beyond measure by this conduct of his wife, from whom he immediately separated. In traveling about the country, Arkwright had become acquainted with a person named Kay, a clockmaker at Warrington, who assisted him in constructing some of the parts of his perpetual motion machinery. It is supposed that he was informed by Kay of the principle of spinning by rollers, but it is also said that the idea was first suggested to him by accidentally observing a red-hot piece of iron become elongated by passing between iron rollers. However this may be, the idea at once took firm possession of his mind, and he proceeded to devise the process by which it was to be accomplished, Kay being able to tell him nothing on this point. Arkwright now abandoned his business of hair collecting, and devoted himself to the perfecting of his machine, a model of which, constructed by Kay under his directions, he set up in the parlour of the Free Grammar School at Preston. Being a burgess of the town, he voted at the contested election at which General Burgoyne was returned, but such was his poverty, and such the tattered state of his dress, that a number of persons subscribed a sum sufficient to have him put in a state fit to appear in the poll-room. The exhibition of his machine in a town where so many work-people lived by the exercise of manual labor proved a dangerous experiment. Ominous growlings were heard outside the schoolroom from time to time, and Arkwright, remembering the fate of Kay, who was mobbed and compelled to fly from Lancashire because of his invention of the fly shuttle, and of poor Hargreaves, whose spinning jenny had been pulled to pieces only a short time before by a Blackburn mob, wisely determined on packing up his model and removing to a less dangerous locality. He went accordingly to Nottingham, where he applied to some of the local bankers for pecuniary assistance, and the Messrs. Wright consented to advance him a sum of money on condition of sharing in the profits of the invention. The machine, however, not being perfected so soon as they had anticipated, the bankers recommended Arkwright to apply to Messrs. Strutt and Need, the former of whom was the ingenious inventor and patentee of the stocking frame. Mr. Strutt at once appreciated the merits of the invention, and a partnership was entered into with Arkwright, whose road to fortune was now clear. The patent was secured in the name of Richard Arkwright, of Nottingham, clockmaker, and it is a circumstance worthy of note, that it was taken out in 1769, the same year in which Watt secured the patent for his steam engine. A cotton mill was first erected at Nottingham, driven by horses. And another was shortly after built, on a much larger scale, at Cromford, in Derbyshire, turned by a water wheel, from which circumstance the spinning machine came to be called the water frame. Arkwright's labours, however, were, comparatively speaking, only begun. He had still to perfect all the working details of his machine. It was in his hands the subject of constant modification and improvement, until eventually it was rendered practicable and profitable in an eminent degree. But success was only secured by long and patient labor. For some years, indeed, the speculation was disheartening and unprofitable, swallowing up a very large amount of capital without any result. When success began to appear more certain, then the Lancashire manufacturers fell upon Arkwright's patent to pull it in pieces, as the Cornish miners fell upon Bolton and Watt to rob them of the profits of their steam engine. Arkwright was even denounced as the enemy of the working people. And a mill which he built near Chorley was destroyed by a mob in the presence of a strong force of police and military. The Lancashire men refused to buy his materials, though they were confessedly the best in the market. Then they refused to pay patent right for the use of his machines, and combined to crush him in the courts of law. To the disgust of right-minded people, Arkwright's patent was upset. After the trial, when passing the hotel at which his opponents were staying, one of them said, loud enough to be heard by him, "Well, we've done the old shaver at last," to which he coolly replied, "Never mind, I've a razor left that will shave you all." He established new mills in Lancashire, Derbyshire, and at New Lanark, in Scotland. The mills at Cromford also came into his hands at the expiry of his partnership with Strutt, and the amount and the excellence of his products were such, that in a short time he obtained so complete a control of the trade, that the prices were fixed by him, and he governed the main operations of the other cotton spinners. Arkwright was a man of great ASM for their service, as each private feels that he may possibly carry the baton of a marshal in his knapsack. The instances of men, in this and other countries, who, by dint of persevering application and energy, have raised themselves from the humblest ranks of industry to eminent positions of usefulness and influence in society, are indeed so numerous that they have long ceased to be regarded as exceptional. Looking at some of the more remarkable, it might almost be said that early encounter with difficulty and adverse circumstances was the necessary and indispensable condition of success. The British House of Commons has always contained a considerable number of such self-raised men, fitting representatives of the industrial character of the people, and it is to the credit of our legislature that they have been welcomed and honoured there. When the late Joseph Brotherton, member for Salford, in the course of the discussion on the 10 Hours Bill, detailed with true pathos the hardships and fatigues to which he had been subjected when working as a factory boy in a cotton mill, and described the resolution which he had then formed, that if ever it was in his power he would endeavour to ameliorate the condition of that class, Sir James Graham rose immediately after him, and declared, amidst the cheers of the House, that he did not before know that Mr. Brotherton's origin had been so humble, but that it rendered him more proud than he had ever before been of the House of Commons, to think that a person risen from that condition should be able to sit side by side, on equal terms, with the hereditary gentry of the land. The late Mr. Fox, member for Oldham, was accustomed to introduce his recollections of past times with the words, "When I was working as a weaver boy at Norwich." And there are other members of Parliament, still living, whose origin has been equally humble. Mr. Lindsay, the well-known ship owner, until recently member for Sunderland, once told the simple story of his life to the electors of Weymouth, in answer to an attack made upon him by his political opponents. He had been left an orphan at 14, and when he left Glasgow for Liverpool to push his way in the world, not being able to pay the usual fare, the captain of the steamer agreed to take his labour in exchange, and the boy worked his passage by trimming the coals in the coal hole. At Liverpool he remained for 7 weeks before he could obtain employment, during which time he lived in sheds and fared hardly, until at last he found shelter on board a West Indiaman. He entered as a boy, and before he was 19, by steady good conduct he had risen to the command of a ship. At 23 he retired from the sea, and settled on shore, after which his progress was rapid. He had prospered, he said, by steady industry, by constant work, and by ever keeping in view the great principle of doing to others as you would be done by. The career of Mr. William Jackson, of Birkenhead, the present member for North Derbyshire, bears considerable resemblance to that of Mr. Lindsay. His father, a surgeon at Lancaster, died, leaving a family of 11 children, of whom William Jackson was the 7th son. The elder boys had been well educated while the father lived, but at his death the younger members had to shift for themselves. William, when under 12 years old, was taken from school, and put to hard work at a ship's side from 6 in the morning till 9 at night. His master falling ill, the boy was taken into the counting-house, where he had more leisure. This gave him an opportunity of reading, and having obtained access to a set of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, he read the volumes through from A to Z, partly by day, but chiefly at night. He afterwards put himself to a trade, was diligent, and succeeded in it. Now he has ships sailing on almost every sea, and holds commercial relations with nearly every country on the globe. Among like men of the same class may be ranked the late Richard Cobden, whose start in life was equally humble. The son of a small farmer at Midhurst in Sussex, he was sent at an early age to London and employed as a boy in a warehouse in the city. He was diligent, well conducted, and eager for information. His master, a man of the old school, warned him against too much reading. But the boy went on in his own course, storing his mind with the wealth found in books. He was promoted from one position of trust to another, became a traveller for his house, secured a large connection, and eventually started in business as a calico printer at Manchester. Taking an interest in public questions, more especially in popular education, his attention was gradually drawn to the subject of the Corn Laws, to the repeal of which he may be said to have devoted his fortune and his life. It may be mentioned as a curious fact that the first speech he delivered in public was a total failure. But he had great perseverance, application, and energy, and with persistency and practice, he became at length one of the most persuasive and effective of public speakers, extorting the disinterested eulogy of even Sir Robert Peel himself. M. Drouin de Lhuys, the French ambassador, has eloquently said of Mr. Cobden, that he was a living proof of what merit, perseverance, and labour can accomplish, one of the most complete examples of those men who, sprung from the humblest ranks of society, raise themselves to the highest rank in public estimation by the effect of their own worth and of their personal services. Finally, one of the rarest examples of the solid qualities inherent in the English character. In all these cases, strenuous individual application was the price paid for distinction. Excellence of any sort being invariably placed beyond the reach of indolence. It is the diligent hand and head alone that maketh rich, in self-culture, growth in wisdom, and in business. Even when men are born to wealth and high social position, any solid reputation which they may individually achieve can only be attained by energetic application, for though an inheritance of acres may be bequeathed, an inheritance of knowledge and wisdom cannot. The wealthy man may pay others for doing his work for him, but it is impossible to get his thinking done for him by another, or to purchase any kind of self-culture. Indeed, the doctrine that excellence in any pursuit is only to be achieved by laborious application, holds as true in the case of the man of wealth as in that of Drew and Gifford, whose only school was a cobbler's stall, or Hugh Miller, whose only college was a Cromarty stone quarry. Riches and ease, it is perfectly clear, are not necessary for man's highest culture, else had not the world been so largely indebted in all times to those who have sprung from the humbler ranks. An easy and luxurious existence does not train men to effort or encounter with difficulty, nor does it awaken that consciousness of power which is so necessary for energetic and effective action in life. Indeed, so far from poverty being a misfortune, it may, by vigorous self-help, be converted even into a blessing, rousing a man to that struggle with the world in which, though some may purchase ease by degradation, the right-minded and true-hearted find strength, confidence, and triumph. Bacon says, "Men seem neither to understand their riches nor their strength, of the former they believe greater things than they should, of the latter much less." Self-reliance and self-denial will teach a man to drink out of his own cistern, and eat his own sweet bread, and to learn and labor truly to get his living, and carefully to expend the good things committed to his trust. Riches are so great a temptation to ease and self-indulgence, to which men are by nature prone, that the glory is all the greater of those who, born to ample fortunes, nevertheless take an active part in the work of their generation. Who scorn delights and live laborious days. It is to the honor of the wealthier ranks in this country that they are not idlers, for they do their fair share of the work of the state, and usually take more than their fair share of its dangers. It was a fine thing said of a subaltern officer in the Peninsular campaigns, observed trudging alone through mud and mire by the side of his regiment, "There goes 15,000 L. a year." And in our own day, the bleak slopes of Sebastopol and the burning soil of India have borne witness to the like noble self-denial and devotion on the part of our gentler classes, many a gallant and noble fellow, of rank and estate, having risked his life, or lost it, in one or other of those fields of action, in the service of his country. Nor have the wealthier classes been undistinguished in the more peaceful pursuits of philosophy and science. Take, for instance, the great names of Bacon, the father of modern philosophy, and of Worcester, Boyle, Cavendish, Talbot, and Ross, in science. The last named may be regarded as the great mechanic of the peerage, a man who, if he had not been born a peer, would probably have taken the highest rank as an inventor. So thorough is his knowledge of smithwork that he is said to have been pressed on one occasion to accept the foremanship of a large workshop, by a manufacturer to whom his rank was unknown. The great Ross telescope, of his own fabrication, is certainly the most extraordinary instrument of the kind that has yet been constructed. But it is principally in the departments of politics and literature that we find the most energetic laborers amongst our higher classes. Success in these lines of action, as in all others, can only be achieved through industry, practice, and study, and the great minister, or parliamentary leader, must necessarily be amongst the very hardest of workers. Such was Palmerston, and such are Derby and Russell, Disraeli and Gladstone. These men have had the benefit of no 10-hours bill, but have often, during the busy season of Parliament, worked, double shift, almost day and night. One of the most illustrious of such workers in modern times was unquestionably the late Sir Robert Peel. He possessed in an extraordinary degree the power of continuous intellectual labor, nor did he spare himself. His career, indeed, presented a remarkable example of how much a man of comparatively moderate powers can accomplish by means of assiduous application and indefatigable industry. During the 40 years that he held a seat in Parliament, his labors were prodigious. He was a most conscientious man, and whatever he undertook to do, he did thoroughly. All his speeches bear evidence of his careful study of everything that had been spoken or written on the subject under consideration. He was elaborate almost to excess, and spared no pains to adapt himself to the various capacities of his audience. Withal, he possessed much practical sagacity, great strength of purpose, and power to direct the issues of action with steady hand and eye. In one respect he surpassed most men, his principles broadened and enlarged with time, and age, instead of contracting, only served to mellow and ripen his nature. To the last he continued open to the reception of new views, and, though many thought him cautious to excess, he did not allow himself to fall into that indiscriminating admiration of the past, which is the palsy of many minds similarly educated, and renders the old age of many nothing but a pity. The indefatigable industry of Lord Brougham has become almost proverbial. His public labors have extended over a period of upwards of 60 years, during which he has ranged over many fields, of law, literature, politics, and science, and achieved distinction in them all. How he contrived it, has been to many a mystery. Once, when Sir Samuel Romilly was requested to undertake some new work, he excused himself by saying that he had no time. But, he added, go with it to that fellow Brougham, he seems to have time for everything. The secret of it was, that he never left a minute unemployed, withal he possessed a constitution of iron. When arrived at an age at which most men would have retired from the world to enjoy their hard-earned leisure, perhaps to doze away their time in an easy chair, Lord Brougham commenced and prosecuted a series of elaborate investigations as to the laws of light, and he submitted the results to the most scientific audiences that Paris and London could muster. About the same time, he was passing through the press his admirable sketches of the men of science and literature of the reign of George III, and taking his full share of the law business and the political discussions in the House of Lords. Sidney Smith once recommended him to confine himself to only the transaction of so much business as 3 strong men could get through. But such was Brougham's love of work, long become a habit, that no amount of application seems to have been too great for him, and such was his love of excellence, that it has been said of him that if his station in life had been only that of a shoeblack, he would never have rested satisfied until he had become the best shoeblack in England. Another hard-working man of the same class is Sir E. Bulwer Lytton. Few writers have done more, or achieved higher distinction in various walks. As a novelist, poet, dramatist, historian, essayist, orator, and politician, he has worked his way step by step, disdainful of ease, and animated throughout by the ardent desire to excel. On the score of mere industry, there are few living English writers who have written so much, and none that have produced so much of high quality. The industry of Bulwer is entitled to all the greater praise that it has been entirely self-imposed. To hunt, and shoot, and live at ease. To frequent the clubs and enjoy the opera, with the variety of London visiting and sight-seeing during the season, and then off to the country mansion, with its well-stocked preserves, and its 1,000 delightful outdoor pleasures, to travel abroad, to Paris, Vienna, or Rome, all this is excessively attractive to a lover of pleasure and a man of fortune, and by no means calculated to make him voluntarily undertake continuous labor of any kind. Yet these pleasures, all within his reach, Bulwer must, as compared with men born to similar estate, have denied himself in assuming the position and pursuing the career of a literary man. Like Byron, his first effort was poetical, Weeds and Wild Flowers, and a failure. His second was a novel, Falkland, and it proved a failure too. A man of weaker nerve would have dropped authorship, but Bulwer had pluck and perseverance, and he worked on, determined to succeed. He was incessantly industrious, read extensively, and from failure went courageously onwards to success. Pelham followed Falkland within a year, and the remainder of Bulwer's literary life, now extending over a period of 30 years, has been a succession of triumphs. Mr. Disraeli affords a similar instance of the power of industry and application in working out an eminent public career. His first achievements were, like Bulwer's, in literature. And he reached success only through a succession of failures. His Wondrous Tale of Ulroy and Revolutionary Epic were laughed at, and regarded as indications of literary lunacy. But he worked on in other directions, and his Coningsby, Sybil, and Tancred proved the sterling stuff of which he was made. As an orator too, his first appearance in the House of Commons was a failure. It was spoken of as more screaming than an Adelphi farce. Though composed in a grand and ambitious strain, every sentence was hailed with loud laughter. Hamlet, played as a comedy, were nothing to it. But he concluded with a sentence which embodied a prophecy. Writhing under the laughter with which his studied eloquence had been received, he exclaimed, "I have begun several times many things, and have succeeded in them at last. I shall sit down now, but the time will come when you will hear me." The time did come. And how Disraeli succeeded in at length commanding the attention of the first assembly of gentlemen in the world, affords a striking illustration of what energy and determination will do, for Disraeli earned his position by dint of patient industry. He did not, as many young men do, having once failed, retired dejected, to mope and whine in a corner, but diligently set himself to work. He carefully unlearnt his faults, studied the character of his audience, practiced sedulously the art of speech, and industriously filled his mind with the elements of parliamentary knowledge. He worked patiently for success, and it came, but slowly. Then the House laughed with him, instead of at him. The recollection of his early failure was effaced, and by general consent he was at length admitted to be one of the most finished and effective of parliamentary speakers. Although much may be accomplished by means of individual industry and energy, as these and other instances set forth in the following pages serve to illustrate, it must at the same time be acknowledged that the help which we derive from others in the journey of life is of very great importance. The poet Wordsworth has well said that these two things, contradictory though they may seem, must go together: manly dependence and manly independence, manly reliance and manly self-reliance. From infancy to old age, all are more or less indebted to others for nurture and culture, and the best and strongest are usually found the readiest to acknowledge such help. Take, for example, the career of the late Alexis de Tocqueville, a man doubly well-born, for his father was a distinguished peer of France, and his mother a granddaughter of Malherbe. Through powerful family influence, he was appointed judge auditor at Versailles when only 21. But probably feeling that he had not fairly won the position by merit, he determined to give it up and owe his future advancement in life to himself alone. A foolish resolution, some will say, but de Tocqueville bravely acted it out. He resigned his appointment, and made arrangements to leave France for the purpose of traveling through the United States, the results of which were published in his great book on Democracy in America. His friend and traveling companion, Gustave de Beaumont, has described his indefatigable industry during this journey. His nature, he says, was wholly averse to idleness, and whether he was traveling or resting, his mind was always at work. With Alexis, the most agreeable conversation was that which was the most useful. The worst day was the lost day, or the day ill spent. The least loss of time annoyed him. Tocqueville himself wrote to a friend: "There is no time of life at which one can wholly cease from action, for effort without one's self, and still more effort within, is equally necessary, if not more so, when we grow old, as it is in youth. I compare man in this world to a traveler journeying without ceasing towards a colder and colder region. The higher he goes, the faster he ought to walk. The great malady of the soul is cold. And in resisting this formidable evil, one needs not only to be sustained by the action of a mind employed, but also by contact with one's fellows in the business of life." 25. Notwithstanding de Tocqueville's decided views as to the necessity of exercising individual energy and self-dependence, no one could be more ready than he was to recognize the value of that help and support for which all men are indebted to others in a greater or less degree. Thus, he often acknowledged, with gratitude, his obligations to his friends de Kergurlay and Stoffels, to the former for intellectual assistance, and to the latter for moral support and sympathy. To de Kergurlay he wrote, "Thine is the only soul in which I have confidence," and W.H. in the English character, and furnishes the true measure of our power as a nation. Rising above the heads of the mass, there were always to be found a series of individuals distinguished beyond others, who commanded the public homage. But our progress has also been owing to multitudes of smaller and less known men. Though only the generals' names may be remembered in the history of any great campaign, it has been in a great measure through the individual valor and heroism of the privates that victories have been won. And life, too, is a soldier's battle, men in the ranks having in all times been amongst the greatest of workers. Many are the lives of men unwritten, which have nevertheless as powerfully influenced civilization and progress as the more fortunate great whose names are recorded in biography. Even the humblest person, who sets before his fellows an example of industry, sobriety, and upright honesty of purpose in life, has a present as well as a future influence upon the well-being of his country. For his life and character pass unconsciously into the lives of others, and propagate good example for all time to come. Daily experience shows that it is energetic individualism which produces the most powerful effects upon the life and action of others, and really constitutes the best practical education. Schools, academies, and colleges give but the merest beginnings of culture in comparison with it. Far more influential is the life education daily given in our homes, in the streets, behind counters, in workshops, at the loom and the plough, in counting houses and manufactories, and in the busy haunts of men. This is that finishing instruction as members of society, which Schiller designated the education of the human race, consisting in action, conduct, self-culture, self-control. All that tends to discipline a man truly, and fit him for the proper performance of the duties and business of life, a kind of education not to be learnt from books, or acquired by any amount of mere literary training. With his usual weight of words Bacon observes, that studies teach not their own use, but that is a wisdom without them, and above them, won by observation, a remark that holds true of actual life, as well as of the cultivation of the intellect itself. For all experience serves to illustrate and enforce the lesson, that a man perfects himself by work more than by reading, that it is life rather than literature, action rather than study, and character rather than biography, which tend perpetually to renovate mankind. Biographies of great, but especially of good men, are nevertheless most instructive and useful, as helps, guides, and incentives to others. Some of the best are almost equivalent to gospels. Teaching high living, high thinking, and energetic action for their own and the world's good. The valuable examples which they furnish of the power of self-help, of patient purpose, resolute working, and steadfast integrity, issuing in the formation of truly noble and manly character, exhibit in language not to be misunderstood, what it is in the power of each to accomplish for himself, and eloquently illustrate the efficacy of self-respect and self-reliance in enabling men of even the humblest rank to work out for themselves an honorable competency and a solid reputation. Great men of science, literature, and art, apostles of great thoughts and lords of the great heart, have belonged to no exclusive class nor rank in life. They have come alike from colleges, workshops, and farmhouses, from the huts of poor men and the mansions of the rich. Some of God's greatest apostles have come from the ranks. The poorest have sometimes taken the highest places, nor have difficulties apparently the most insuperable proved obstacles in their way. Those very difficulties, in many instances, would ever seem to have been their best helpers, by evoking their powers of labor and endurance, and stimulating into life faculties which might otherwise have lain dormant. The instances of obstacles thus surmounted, and of triumphs thus achieved, are indeed so numerous, as almost to justify the proverb that with will one can do anything. Take, for instance, the remarkable fact, that from the barber's shop came Jeremy Taylor, the most poetical of divines, Sir Richard Arkwright, the inventor of the spinning jenny and founder of the cotton manufacture, Lord Tenterden, one of the most distinguished of Lord Chief Justices, and Turner, the greatest among landscape painters. No one knows to a certainty what Shakespeare was, but it is unquestionable that he sprang from a humble rank. His father was a butcher and grazier, and Shakespeare himself is supposed to have been in early life a woolcomber, whilst others aver that he was an usher in a school and afterwards a scrivener's clerk. He truly seems to have been not one, but all mankind's epitome. For such is the accuracy of his sea phrases that a naval writer alleges that he must have been a sailor, whilst a clergyman infers, from internal evidence in his writings, that he was probably a parson's clerk, and a distinguished judge of horseflesh insists that he must have been a horse-dealer. Shakespeare was certainly an actor, and in the course of his life, played many parts, gathering his wonderful stores of knowledge from a wide field of experience and observation. In any event, he must have been a close student and a hard worker, and to this day his writings continue to exercise a powerful influence on the formation of English character. The common class of day labourers has given us Brindley the engineer, Cook the navigator, and Burns the poet. Masons and bricklayers can boast of Ben Jonson, who worked at the building of Lincoln's Inn, with a trowel in his hand and a book in his pocket, Edwards and Telford the engineers, Hugh Miller the geologist, and Alan Cunningham the writer and sculptor, whilst among distinguished carpenters we find the names of Inigo Jones the architect, Harrison the chronometer maker, John Hunter the physiologist, Romney and Opie the painters, Professor Lee the orientalist, and John Gibson the sculptor. From the Weaver class have sprung Simpson the mathematician, Bacon the sculptor, the two Milners, Adam Walker, John Foster, Wilson the ornithologist, Dr. Livingstone the missionary traveler, and Tannahill the poet. Shoemakers have given us Sir Cloudesley Shovel the great admiral, Sturgeon the electrician, Samuel Drew the essayist, Gifford the editor of the Quarterly Review, Bloomfield the poet, and William Carey the missionary. Whilst Morrison, another laborious missionary, was a maker of shoelasts. Within the last few years, a profound naturalist has been discovered in the person of a shoemaker at Banff, named Thomas Edwards, who, while maintaining himself by his trade, has devoted his leisure to the study of natural science in all its branches, his researches in connection with the smaller crustacea having been rewarded by the discovery of a new species, to which the name of Pronyza edwardsii has been given by naturalists. Nor have tailors been undistinguished. John Stowe, the historian, worked at the trade during some part of his life. Jackson, the painter, made clothes until he reached manhood. The brave Sir John Hawkeswood, who so greatly distinguished himself at Poitiers, and was knighted by Edward III for his valour, was in early life apprenticed to a London tailor. Admiral Hobson, who broke the boom at Vigo in 1702, belonged to the same calling. He was working as a tailor's apprentice near Bonchurch, in the Isle of Wight, when the news flew through the village that a squadron of men of war was sailing off the island. He sprang from the shopboard, and ran down with his comrades to the beach, to gaze upon the glorious sight. The boy was suddenly inflamed with the ambition to be a sailor, and springing into a boat, he rowed off to the squadron, gained the admiral's ship, and was accepted as a volunteer. Years after, he returned to his native village full of honors, and dined off bacon and eggs in the cottage where he had worked as an apprentice. But the greatest tailor of all is unquestionably Andrew Johnson, the present President of the United States, a man of extraordinary force of character and vigor of intellect. In his great speech at Washington, when describing himself as having begun his political career as an alderman, and run through all the branches of the legislature, a voice in the crowd cried, "From a tailor up." It was characteristic of Johnson to take the intended sarcasm in good part, and even to turn it to account. Some gentleman says I have been a tailor. That does not disconcert me in the least, for when I was a tailor I had the reputation of being a good one, and making close fits. I was always punctual with my customers, and always did good work. Cardinal Wolsey, Defoe, Akenside, and Kirk White were the sons of butchers, Bunyan was a tinker, and Joseph Lancaster a basket-maker. Among the great names identified with the invention of the steam engine are those of Newcomen, Watt, and Stephenson, the first a blacksmith, the second a maker of mathematical instruments, and the third an engine fireman. Huntingdon the preacher was originally a coal-heaver, and Buick, the father of wood engraving, a coal miner. Dodsley was a footman, and Holcroft a groom. Baffin the navigator began his seafaring career as a man before the mast, and Sir Cloudesley Shovel as a cabin boy. Herschel played the oboe in a military band. Chantry was a journeyman carver, Eddy a journeyman printer, and Sir Thomas Lawrence the son of a tavern keeper. Michael Faraday, the son of a blacksmith, was in early life apprenticed to a bookbinder, and worked at that trade until he reached his 22nd year. He now occupies the very first rank as a philosopher, excelling even his master, Sir Humphrey Davy, in the art of lucidly expounding the most difficult and abstruse points in natural science. Among those who have given the greatest impulse to the sublime science of astronomy, we find Copernicus, the son of a Polish baker. Kepler, the son of a German public-house keeper, and himself the garçon de cabaret, D'Alembert, a foundling picked up one winter's night on the steps of the church of Saint Jean le Rond at Paris, and brought up by the wife of a glazier, and Newton and Laplace, the one the son of a small freeholder near Grantham, the other the son of a poor peasant of Beaumont en Auge, near Honfleur. Notwithstanding their comparatively adverse circumstances in early life, these distinguished men achieved a solid and enduring reputation by the exercise of their genius, which all the wealth in the world could not have purchased. The very possession of wealth might indeed have proved an obstacle greater even than the humble means to which they were born. The father of Lagrange, the astronomer and mathematician, held the office of treasurer of war at Turin. But having ruined himself by speculations, his family were reduced to comparative poverty. To this circumstance Lagrange was in after life accustomed partly to attribute his own fame and happiness. "Had I been rich," said he, "I should probably not have become a mathematician." The sons of clergymen and ministers of religion generally, have particularly distinguished themselves in our country's history. Amongst them we find the names of Drake and Nelson, celebrated in naval heroism; of Wollaston, Young, Playfair, and Bell, in science; of Wren, Reynolds, Wilson, and Wilkie, in art; of Thurlow and Campbell, in law; and of Addison, Thomson, Goldsmith, Coleridge, and Tennyson, in literature. Lord Hardinge, Colonel Edwards, and Major Hodson, so honorably known in Indian warfare, were also the sons of clergymen. Indeed, the Empire of England in India was won and held chiefly by men of the middle class, such as Clive, Warren Hastings, and their successors. Men for the most part bred in factories and trained to habits of business. Among the sons of attorneys we find Edmund Burke, Smeaton the engineer, Scott and Wordsworth, and Lord Somers, Hardwicke, and Dunning. Sir William Blackstone was the posthumous son of a silk mercer. Lord Gifford's father was a grocer at Dover, Lord Denman's a physician, Judge Talfourd's a country brewer, and Lord Chief Baron Pollock's a celebrated saddler at Charing Cross. Layard, the discoverer of the monuments of Nineveh, was an articled clerk in a London solicitor's office, and Sir William Armstrong, the inventor of hydraulic machinery and of the Armstrong Ordnance, was also trained to the law and practiced for some time as an attorney. Milton was the son of a London scrivener, and Pope and Southey were the sons of linendrapers. Professor Wilson was the son of a Paisley manufacturer, and Lord Macaulay of an African merchant. Keats was a druggist, and Sir Humphrey Davy a country apothecary's apprentice. Speaking of himself, Davy once said, "What I am I have made myself, I say this without vanity, and in pure simplicity of heart." Richard Owen, the Newton of natural history, began life as a midshipman, and did not enter upon the line of scientific research in which he has since become so distinguished, until comparatively late in life. He laid the foundations of his great knowledge while occupied in cataloguing the magnificent museum accumulated by the industry of John Hunter, a work which occupied him at the College of Surgeons during a period of about 10 years. Foreign not less than English biography abounds in illustrations of men who have glorified the lot of poverty by their labors and their genius. In art we find Claude, the son of a pastry cook, Jeeves, of a baker, Leopold Robert, of a watchmaker, and Haydn, of a wheelwright, whilst Daguerre was a scene painter at the opera. The father of Gregory VII. Was a carpenter, of Sextus V, a shepherd, and of Adrian VI, a poor bargeman. When a boy, Adrian, unable to pay for a light by which to study, was accustomed to prepare his lessons by the light of the lamps in the streets and the church porches, exhibiting a degree of patience and industry which were the certain forerunners of his future distinction. Of like humble origin were Howie, the mineralogist, who was the son of a weaver of Saint Just, Hautefeuille, the mechanician, of a baker at Orleans, Joseph Fourier, the mathematician, of a tailor at Auxerre, Durand, the architect, of a Paris shoemaker, and Gessner, the naturalist, of a skinner or worker in hides, at Zurich. This last began his career under all the disadvantages attendant on poverty, sickness, and domestic calamity. None of which, however, were sufficient to damp his courage or hinder his progress. His life was indeed an eminent illustration of the truth of the saying, that those who have most to do and are willing to work, will find the most time. Pierre Ramus was another man of like character. He was the son of poor parents in Picardy, and when a boy was employed to tend sheep. But not liking the occupation he ran away to Paris. After encountering much misery, he succeeded in entering the College of Navarre as a servant. The situation, however, opened for him the road to learning, and he shortly became one of the most distinguished men of his time. The chemist Vauquelin was the son of a peasant of Saint-André de Herbetot, in the Calvados. When a boy at school, though poorly clad, he was full of bright intelligence. And the master, who taught him to read and write, when praising him for his diligence, used to say, "Go on, my boy, work, study, Colin, and one day you will go as well dressed as the parish churchwarden." A country apothecary who visited the school, admired the robust boy's arms, and offered to take him into his laboratory to pound his drugs, to which Vauquelin assented, in the hope of being able to continue his lessons. But the apothecary would not permit him to spend any part of his time in learning, and on ascertaining this, the youth immediately determined to quit his service. He therefore left Saint-André and took the road for Paris with his haversack on his back. Arrived there, he searched for a place as apothecary's boy, but could not find one. Worn out by fatigue and destitution, Vauquelin fell ill, and in that state was taken to the hospital, where he thought he should die. But better things were in store for the poor boy. He recovered, and again proceeded in his search of employment, which he at length found with an apothecary. Shortly after, he became known to Fourcroy the eminent chemist, who was so pleased with the youth that he made him his private secretary, and many years after, on the death of that great philosopher, Vauquelin succeeded him as professor of chemistry. Finally, in 1829, the electors of the district of Calvados appointed him their representative in the Chamber of Deputies, and he re-entered in triumph the village which he had left so many years before, so poor and so obscure. England has no parallel instances to show, of promotions from the ranks of the army to the highest military offices, which have been so common in France since the First Revolution. La Carrière ouverte aux talents has there received many striking illustrations, which would doubtless be matched among ourselves were the road to promotion as open. Hoche, Humbert, and Pichegru began their respective careers as private soldiers. Hoche, while in the king's army, was accustomed to embroider waistcoats to enable him to earn money wherewith to purchase books on military science. Humbert was a scapegrace when a youth. At 16 he ran away from home, and was by turn servant to a tradesman at Nancy, a workman at Lyons, and a hawker of rabbit skins. In 1792, he enlisted as a volunteer, and in a year he was general of brigade. Kleber, Lefebvre, Suchet, Victor, Lons, Soult, Messina, Saint-Cyr, Derlin, Murat, Augereau, Bessières, and Ney, all rose from the ranks. In some cases promotion was rapid, in others it was slow. Saint-Cyr, the son of a tanner of Toul, began life as an actor, after which he enlisted in the chasseurs, and was promoted to a captaincy within a year. Victor, Duc de Belluno, enlisted in the artillery in 1781, during the events preceding the Revolution he was discharged, but immediately on the outbreak of war he re-enlisted, and in the course of a few months his intrepidity and ability secured his promotion as adjutant major and chief of battalion. Murat, Le Beau Sabreur, was the son of a village innkeeper in Périgord, where he looked after the horses. He first enlisted in a regiment of chasseurs, from which he was dismissed for insubordination, but again enlisting, he shortly rose to the rank of colonel. Ney enlisted at 18 in a hussar regiment, and gradually advanced step by step. Kleber soon discovered his merits, surnaming him, the Indefatigable, and promoted him to be adjutant general when only 25. On the other hand, Soult, 15, was 6 years from the date of his enlistment before he reached the rank of sergeant. But Soult's advancement was rapid compared with that of Messina, who served for 14 years before he was made sergeant, and though he afterwards rose successively, step by step, to the grades of colonel, general of division, and marshal, he declared that the post of sergeant was the step which of all others had cost him the most labor to win. Similar promotions from the ranks, in the French army, have continued down to our own day. Chaingarnier entered the king's bodyguard as a private in 1815. Marshal Bugeaud served 4 years in the ranks, after which he was made an officer. Marshal Randon, the present French Minister of War, began his military career as a drummer boy, and in the portrait of him in the gallery at Versailles, his hand rests upon a drum head, the picture being thus painted at his own request. Instances such as these inspire French soldiers with enthusiasm.